The city noise never really changes in Z City, not even at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday, and that was the first thing wrong with the morning, though nobody noticed it yet. Saitama stood third in line outside the discount grocer, arms crossed, watching the security shudder through half-lidded eyes like it owed him money. Cabbage was 40% off, not 30, 40. He had already done the math 4 times walking over, because 40% off a bag of cabbage was the difference between eating for 3 days and eating for 4, and 4 mattered more than most people would understand, unless they had also spent a year answering to nobody and nothing except a bank account that flatlined somewhere around 800 yen. "You're up early," said the woman behind him, an older regular he vaguely recognized from the fish counter 3 shops down. "Sale," Saitab said, and that was the whole conversation, because that was the whole reason. Behind him, standing slightly too straight, slightly too alert for a man in line for produce, Genos scanned the street with the quiet, permanent vigilance of someone who had once watched his hometown burn and had never quite let his internal threat assessment shut back off. His optical sensors ticked through wavelengths nobody else could see. Heat signatures, structural stress in the shutter housing, a stray cat's pulse 2 alleys over. All normal, all boring. He hated boring mornings almost as much as he'd once hated the cyborg who took his family, because boring mornings meant Saitama-sensei's talents were, once again, going completely unused by a world too small to need them. "Sensei," Genos said, "I've recalibrated my seismic sensors according to the specifications you approved last week. I believe I can now detect anomalies down to a magnitude of cabbage," Saitama said, pointing at the shutter as it began, finally, to rise. Genos exhaled through his vents, a small metallic sigh that had become, over the months of their strange domestic arrangement, something like a shrug. He followed his teacher inside anyway. He always did. They were 3 aisles in, Saitama holding 2 bags of cabbage like he'd won a prize, actually smiling for possibly the first time that week, when the ground did something it had never done before. It didn't shake. Z City had earthquakes. Everyone in Japan grew up knowing the particular rolling lurch of a quake, the way dishes rattled before your body understood why. This wasn't that. This was more like the world had briefly forgotten which way was down, and then remembered a half-second too late. A single sick lurch that made the fluorescent lights flicker gold instead of white, and every phone in the store screamed the same emergency alert tone at once, and then went silent, and then screamed again with a different tone nobody in the store had ever heard. "Sensei," Genos said, and his voice had changed, the vigilance cranking instantly to something sharper. "That is not a seismic event. That is not consistent with any." The lights went gold again, longer this time. Outside, in the middle of the crosswalk, a delivery scooter had simply stopped working, its rider staring down at dead instruments, and above the row of shops the sky had taken on a strange, faint shimmer, like heat distortion over asphalt, except it was 6 in the morning in early spring, and nothing should have been hot enough to do that. Saitama looked up from his cabbage. "Huh," he said, in the exact tone of a man noticing it might rain later. That was, more or less, the full extent of his concern, right up until the shimmer over the intersection tore open like wet paper, and the world on the other side of it was not sky at all. 3,000 kilometers of ocean and 1 continent away, in a monarch field outpost bolted onto the cliffs above a fishing village on the western edge of Kyushu, Dr. Elaine Andrews was 3 sips into her second coffee when the outpost's gravitational anomaly sensors, dormant since the last confirmed Titan movement 11 days prior, lit up so hard that 2 of them physically overloaded and had to be manually reset. "Josh," she said, not yet raising her voice, because raising her voice at Josh Valentine tended to make him worse, not better. "Tell me what I'm looking at." Josh was already half out of his chair, headphones around his neck, laptop balanced on one knee, as he cross-referenced 3 different readouts that were all, as far as he could tell, disagreeing violently with each other. I'm looking at a gravitational spike that doesn't match any Titan signature we've cataloged. It doesn't match Hollow Earth resonance either. It's not, Eileen, it's not shaped like anything. It's not radiating out from a point. It's like a seam, like something got unstitched. Unstitched, she repeated. That's the best word I've got at 6 in the morning. Yeah. Bernie Hayes, 3 monitors down, had gone very still in the particular way that meant he'd found something and didn't like it. There's a resonance echo, he said. Same signature, different location. 2 of them, simultaneous. 2 of what? 2 seams, Bernie said. One's local. Inland, maybe 40 clicks from here, near the coastal shelf. The other ones. He trailed off, squinting at coordinates that made no sense to him, even after 15 years of making his living, understanding things that made no sense to everyone else. The other one's not on Earth, or it is. I need to run this twice. Eileen set her coffee down very carefully, the way a person does when their hands have started to want to shake, and they've decided not to let them. Run it twice, she said. Then get eyes on the local one. Ground team, minimal footprint, observation only. Nobody touches anything until we know what we're looking at. Outside the outpost windows, gulls that had been circling the harbor all morning suddenly banked hard and scattered inland, all at once, the way they only ever did before something enormous moved beneath the water. The tear in the air over the Z-City intersection didn't look like an explosion or a wound. It looked, if anything, like a held breath, a stillness with edges, faintly luminous, rippling at its border like the surface of a pond disturbed from underneath. Through it, for 1 full second before it widened, Saitama could see gray sky that wasn't Z-City's sky, and water, a huge, churning, iron-colored expanse of ocean, where there should have been more crosswalk. That's new, Saitama said. Sensei, get back. Genos didn't finish the sentence, because the seam widened all at once, silently, a soap bubble pop with no sound at all, and the pull came a half-second later. Not wind, not quite, but a suction that yanked napkins and grocery bags in one very surprised pigeon, straight off the pavement and into the gray. Saitama, holding 2 bags of 40% off cabbage, felt the pull tug at his sleeve with about as much force as a determined toddler. He looked at the cabbage. He looked at the tear in the world. He looked back at the cabbage. Ah, come on, he said, with real, genuine irritation, the first strong emotion he'd shown all week. I just bought this. Then the suction found real purchase, not on him, but on the produce stand behind him, which went over in an avalanche of onions and daikon, and 1 airborne fish crate, and the shopkeeper screamed, and an old man near the register lost his footing, and that was the part that actually moved Saitama, because falling old men were a category of problem he understood completely and immediately, and he crossed the aisle in less time than it took Genos to finish turning his head. He caught the old man one-handed. He caught a second falling shelf with the other, and in the half-second it took him to set both down gently, because that mattered to him even when nothing else did. The pull from the seam widened again, and this time it caught him too. Sensei! Genos didn't think. He never really did, in these moments. That was a thing Kuseno had built out of him on purpose, a subsystem that overrode hesitation the instant Saitama's safety was even theoretically in question, even though logically, factually, after everything Genos had personally witnessed, there was no version of safety that applied less to any human being on the planet. He fired his boot thrusters and threw himself after his teacher anyway, because it wasn't really about logic. It never had been. The last thing anyone in the grocery store saw was a bald man in a yellow jumpsuit, still holding one bag of cabbage, disappearing sideways into a tear in the sky, with an expression of mild, put-upon annoyance, followed immediately by a young man wreathed in thruster fire shouting his name, and then the scene closed behind them with the same silent pop it had opened with, leaving behind scattered onions, one very confused old man, and absolutely no explanation that made sense to anyone who filed the incident report. The scene Monarch's sensors had flagged as local tore open 40 kilometers inland from the outpost, in the middle of an old cedar forest on a slope nobody had built on in decades, and it announced itself first as a pressure change, birds going silent all at once, and then as light, a faint gold shimmer between the trees that the two-person ground team, dispatched with strict observation-only orders, caught on their first drone pass. "I've got movement," said the younger of the two, a field tech named Wada, who'd been with Monarch less than a year, and had never seen an anomaly firsthand, only in training footage. "Elaine, I've got two people. Two people came through. In the outpost." Elaine leaned into the comm. "Say again." "Two individuals. Sir, one of them is on fire. Not hurt, I don't think. There's fire coming off his arms. It looks intentional. Do not engage," Elaine said, already moving, already grabbing her jacket off the chair. "Observation only. Confirm status. Do not approach. Do not. Wada, do you copy? Do not approach." Through the drone feed, grainy and gray-green in the cedar shade, they watched a slight, bald man in yellow help a young man in a smoking coat up off the forest floor, dust off his own jumpsuit with two brisk pats, glance around at the trees with an expression Bernie would later describe in his incident notes as the least impressed I have ever seen a human being look at anything, including my own divorce, and say something to his companion that the drone's mic caught only as a fragment, tinny and small, across 40 kilometers of static. "Man, I dropped the cabbage." Josh, watching over Elaine's shoulder, said the thing they were all thinking, and none of them wanted to be the one to say first. "Okay," he said slowly. "So, whoever that is, he does not seem to know he should be scared." Elaine didn't answer right away. She was watching the readout beside the drone feed instead, the gravitational anomaly sensor, the one that had spiked hard enough to overload 2 units, now settling into a steady, low baseline hum that made absolutely no sense for a human body of any kind, let alone one calmly complaining about groceries in the middle of a forest that, according to every survey Monarch had ever run, sat less than 60 kilometers from a confirmed deep-water Titan corridor. "No," she said finally. "I don't think he does. I think that might be the problem." Outside the cedar canopy, far to the west, the sea had begun, almost imperceptibly, to swell. The drone hovered at a respectful 60 meters, close enough to keep the two of them in frame, far enough that Elaine had convinced herself it counted as prudent distance rather than fear. It didn't feel like enough of either. "Wada, report," she said into the comm, watching the feed over Josh's shoulder. "What's your status?" "Holding position, ma'am. They're not moving toward us. The younger one keeps scanning the tree line. I think he's picked up our drone's heat signature, but neither of them's approached." "Good. Stay there. Do not make contact until I arrive." "Copy that." Though, a pause, the particular pause of a field tech deciding whether a detail was worth flagging or would just get him laughed at later. "Ma'am, the bald one just ate something. I think it was a piece of raw cabbage, straight out of the bag." Josh made a small, strangled sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Eileen didn't laugh. She'd learned a long time ago that the moments that read as absurd on a live feed were very often the moments right before something reframed the whole situation, and she had not stopped feeling, in her gut, the low, persistent hum of the anomaly reading, refusing to resolve into anything her training had a category for. Get the truck, she told Josh. You're driving. Bernie, stay on comms. Keep running that gravitational signature against every database we've got, including the ones we're not supposed to still have access to. Bernie didn't look up from his monitors. Already doing that. You're not going to like what it's not matching. I don't like most of what it's already told me. Go. The forest road out to the cedar slope was unpaved for the last 4 kilometers, and Josh took it faster than the outpost's aging 4x4 strictly approved of, jouncing hard enough over root-buckled dirt that Elaine had to brace one hand against the dash to keep her coffee, which she'd, against all sense, brought with her, from ending up in her lap. Talk to me about protocol, Josh said, eyes on the road, voice pitched too fast, too bright, the way it always got right before a field encounter, because I want to make sure I've got this right. Unknown origin, unknown species designation, unconfirmed hostile intent, drone footage suggesting at least one combustion-capable physiology. He's not a Titan, Elaine said. You don't know that. I know the gravitational signature isn't Titan consistent, and I know a Titan doesn't eat cabbage out of a plastic bag like it's a mid-morning snack. She exhaled. I know I don't know what he is. That's the whole reason we don't shoot first. Nobody's shooting anybody. I didn't bring a gun. I brought a recorder and a very bad feeling. Keep both running. The truck broke the tree line into the small clearing where Wada and his drone still held position, and there they were, exactly as the feed had shown, except larger now, more solid, more undeniably there, in a way that pixels on a screen hadn't quite managed to convey. The younger one, all sharp angles and half-exposed cybernetics, had positioned himself slightly in front of his companion in a stance Eileen recognized immediately as someone braced to fight. The bald one stood behind him with his hands in his jumpsuit pockets, cabbage bag looped over one wrist, looking less like he was braced for anything, and more like a man waiting for a bus that was running late. Elaine got out first, hands visible, empty, moving slowly. Josh followed a half-step behind with the recorder held low and unthreatening. Wada stayed by the drone controls. My name is Elaine Andrews, she called across the clearing, in careful, clear Japanese, then English as a fallback. I work for an organization called Monarch. We study anomalous phenomena. We are not here to hurt you. We just want to understand what happened. The young cyborg's optical sensors narrowed on her, a faint mechanical whir, audible even at this distance. State your intentions plainly, he said, in Japanese, his voice carrying an odd formal edge, like a man translating threat assessment protocol directly into speech. If this is a trap, I will act. It's not a trap. Elaine kept her hands where he could see them. You came through some kind of dimensional rupture. So did we, in a sense. Our sensors registered it from 100 kilometers away. I don't know where you're from. I'd like to find out, if you're willing to talk. The bald man finally spoke, and it took Elaine a beat to recalibrate. His tone was so flat, so utterly unbothered, that it took her a second to register it as speech directed at her, rather than idle muttering. Are we in trouble? He said, not really a question, more like a formality he was getting out of the way. No, Elaine said honestly, not unless you want to be. Good. He glanced sideways at his companion. Genos, it's fine. Sit down or something, you look like you're gonna pull something. Sensei, we don't know these people. They've got a truck and she's not holding a weapon. Relax. He looked back at Elaine, and something in his flat expression shifted, very slightly, into something almost like curiosity, the first real engagement he'd shown since the drone picked them up. Where are we? Kyushu, Japan. Huh, okay. He nodded slowly, like this answered exactly nothing, and he'd decided he was fine with that. I'm Saitama. This is Genos. We were buying cabbage. Josh, despite himself, let out a small breath of laughter, immediately smothered when Elaine shot him a look. You said cabbage was cheap, Genos said, with what might have been the ghost of exasperated fondness. And then the sky opened. Yeah, rude timing. Saitama looked down at the bag, checked its contents, seemed satisfied that most of it had survived the trip. So what's the deal with this place? Why's there a drone? Why do you guys have an organization for weird stuff falling out of the sky? Elaine glanced at Josh, a silent conversation passing between them. How much do we say? How fast? And made the call the way she'd learned to make it over a decade of first contacts that had ranged from a newborn Titan hatchling to a woman who'd spent 3 years alone on Skull Island and forgotten how to speak in complete sentences. Honesty, calibrated, offered a little at a time. Our world has creatures in it, she said. Ancient ones. Enormous. We call them Titans. Most of them have been dormant for a long time, but they're waking, more and more, and they're powerful enough that conventional understanding doesn't really apply to them. Monarch exists to study them, sometimes to try to keep the peace between them and us. She paused. One of them, in particular, is the reason we take dimensional and gravitational anomalies as seriously as we do. We've learned, the hard way, that when the world stops making sense, it's usually him. Him, Saitama repeated. Godzilla, Eileen said, and watched for the flicker of recognition that never came. Because of course it wouldn't. Because whatever world this man had fallen out of clearly had never heard the name before. And there was something strange and destabilizing about saying it to someone whose blank expression made it, for the first time in a long while, sound almost silly out loud. That a person? Saitama asked. No, not exactly. He's an apex predator, ancient, radioactive, roughly the size of a skyscraper, capable of leveling a city in an afternoon. He's saved us as often as he's threatened us, honestly. But calling him a him is more courtesy than accuracy. He's a force, mostly. One we've spent decades learning to survive around. There was a pause. Genos's sensors had gone very still, processing, cross-referencing against a threat classification framework that had nothing in its library for skyscraper-sized radioactive apex predator, and was visibly straining to build one from scratch. Saitama scratched the back of his neck. Sounds like a handful, he said, in the exact tone he might have used to describe a large dog. Elaine, who had watched grown men, trained soldiers, decorated officers, go pale and silent at a first briefing on Godzilla's scale, found herself, for a strange half-second, at a genuine loss for how to respond to that. Yes, she managed. It's more than a handful. It's the reason half our global defense infrastructure exists in its current form. Okay, Saitama nodded again, filing this away with the same mild interest he'd shown the forest, the drone, the entire premise of interdimensional travel. So what do you want from us? It was, Elaine thought, a remarkably good question, and not one she had a clean answer to yet. Right now, just to talk, to understand what you are, where you're from, whether the rupture that brought you here poses any risk of recurring, and to figure out how to keep you safe while we sort that out, because two strangers with, frankly, deeply unusual physiologies showing up in the middle of active Titan territory is not a situation I want to handle badly. Deeply unusual, Genos repeated, something almost offended in his tone. I am a precision-engineered cybernetic combat platform, built by one of the greatest scientific minds of my generation. Sensei is... He stopped. Sensei is what? Elaine prompted gently. Genos hesitated, which was, in itself, informative. A machine built for near-instant threat assessment, visibly weighing how much truth a stranger deserved. He is the strongest being I have ever encountered, Genos said finally. In any world, Elaine absorbed that the way she absorbed most extraordinary claims in the field. Filed, flagged, neither dismissed nor accepted. held at careful arm's length until evidence either confirmed or dismantled it. She'd learned that lesson from Kong too once, a long time ago. The wildest-sounding claim in this line of work was disproportionately likely to also be true. "Strongest how?" she asked. Saitama shrugged, the cabbage bag swinging faintly on his wrist. "I dunno. Strong. I punch stuff and it stops being a problem. A beat. It's kind of boring, honestly." Josh, who had been recording the entire exchange with the slack-jawed focus of a man watching his podcast content quota fill itself for the next 6 months, finally found his voice. Sorry. I have to ask. Boring? You're saying you're the strongest being this man has ever seen, in any world, and your reaction to that is boring?" "Yeah." Saitama looked at him like the question itself was strange. "Nothing's ever, like, a real fight. You train for years to get strong enough to handle anything, and then when anything shows up, it's just over. One hit. Every time." He scratched his jaw. "I used to think it'd feel good. Mostly it just feels like doing the dishes." There was a silence in the clearing that Elaine felt in her chest more than heard. The particular silence of a claim so quietly, mundanely delivered that it bypassed every instinct that would normally flag it as insane, and landed instead as simple, uncomfortable fact. "You understand," she said carefully, "that if even a fraction of that is true, you've just described yourself as more dangerous than anything currently cataloged on this planet. I mean, I guess." Saitama didn't sound proud of it, or frightened by it, or anything at all, really. The observation seemed to land on him with the same weight as a weather report. "I don't really think about it like that. I just don't like it when stuff gets destroyed that shouldn't be. So I stop it. Then it's done." Genos, beside him, straightened slightly, pride flickering under the rigid posture, the closest thing to warmth Elaine had seen cross his face since they'd arrived. "He has saved this world more times than the Hero Association gives him credit for," he said. "He is ranked far below where his true strength warrants, because bureaucracy is slow and vanity runs deep, but I have seen him end threats that should have taken cities with them, and he does it as though it costs him nothing, because to him, it doesn't." Elaine looked between the two of them, the earnest, bristling loyalty of the cyborg, and the man he was defending, who stood there looking mildly embarrassed by the whole speech, like he'd rather be talking about cabbage again, and felt the particular vertigo of a scientist watching a working model of the world quietly, irreversibly crack. Behind her, Bernie's voice crackled faintly over the truck's radio, urgent in a way that cut straight through the moment. Elaine, you copy?" She turned, one hand rising instinctively to keep the newcomers in her peripheral vision. "Go ahead. You need to hear this now, not later." A pause, the sound of Bernie shuffling something on his end, the particular rasp in his voice that meant he'd found something, and hated that he had. That gravitational spike didn't just open a hole in the sky and close again clean. "There's residual resonance bleeding off the coastal shelf, west of your position. The same corridor we've been tracking low-frequency activity in for the last 6 days. It's ramping, fast. I've got depth sensors picking up displacement patterns consistent with..." "Elaine, it's consistent with a wake-up pattern. A big one." Elaine felt her stomach drop in the specific, familiar way it always did before a briefing turned into an emergency. "How big?" "Big as the last confirmed sighting off Kyushu. Bigger, maybe. I don't have a clean read yet, the resonance from the ruptures still muddying the signal, but whatever tore that hole in the sky, it didn't do it quietly. Something in that corridor heard it." Behind her, Saitama had gone very still, and for the first time since the clearing, something in his posture had actually shifted. Not fear, not urgency exactly, but a low, attentive stillness that Elaine recognized instantly as the specific readiness of someone who had just heard the word big used by a professional and taken it, correctly, as information rather than noise. "That the guy," he said. "Godzilla." Eileen turned back to him slowly. "I don't know yet. It's early. It could be nothing. Displacement echoes happen. Deep water currents shift. It's not always. But it could be him. It could be him," she admitted. Saitama looked down at his cabbage bag, considered it for a long moment with an expression Elaine would later describe, in her incident report, as disproportionately troubled given the actual stakes of the object in question, and then set it gently on a fallen log, like a man putting down something he intended to come back for. "Okay," he said. "Where's the water?" "Saitama," Elaine started. "You said he's dangerous. You said half your defense whatever is built around him. You've got people who'll be near that water when it wakes up, right? Fishing town, drone team, whoever." He rolled one shoulder, loose, unbothered, the gesture of a man about to go pick something up off a high shelf, rather than a man about to walk toward the single most dangerous confirmed entity on the planet. "So where's the water?" Genos was already moving to his side, thrusters warming with a low orange glow along his forearms. "Sensei, we don't know this creature's capabilities. We should gather more information before." "Genos." "Yes, Sensei. You coming or not?" Elaine stood in the clearing, coffee gone cold and forgotten somewhere on the truck's dashboard, watching two strangers from a world she had no name for prepare to walk toward the one thing every protocol monarch had ever written existed specifically to keep people away from, and understood, with the particular clarity that came right before her entire professional framework was about to be tested past its limits, that whatever the next several hours held, observation only had already quietly stopped being an option. "Wait," she said, and reached for the truck radio instead of stopping them, because some instinct older than protocol told her that stopping this man from walking toward the water was neither possible nor, strangely, the right call to make. "Bernie, get General Command on the line. Tell them we may have a contact situation developing off the western shelf, and tell them," she hesitated, searching for words that would not get her laughed out of a briefing room and settling, finally, for the truth. "Tell them we've got an unknown variable heading toward it voluntarily, and I don't think anyone alive can talk him out of it." The road to the coast ran through terrain that shifted, mile by mile, from cedar forest to open farmland, to the salt-bleached scrub of the shoreline proper, and Eileen spent most of the drive on the radio, juggling 3 separate conversations at once, while Josh white-knuckled the wheel and kept glancing in the rearview mirror at the 2 figures jogging, unhurried, easy, like men out for a morning constitutional, matching the truck's pace without visible effort. "They're keeping up with a moving vehicle," Josh said. "Not for the first time. On foot, on a dirt road, without breathing hard." "I see it, Josh. I'm just saying, for the record, out loud, that this is objectively insane." Noted. Eileen had the radio pressed to her ear, half her attention on the road, half on the voice crackling through it. "Say that again, Bernie." "Depth sensors have it," Bernie said, his voice tighter now, stripped of its usual dry humor. "Whatever's moving out there, it's big, it's fast, and it's heading shoreward. Trajectories consistent with the old migratory pattern, same corridor he used during the 19 event. I can't confirm ID without visual, but Eileen, if I had to bet, you'd bet Godzilla." "I'd bet Godzilla." She exhaled slowly, watching the coast road unspool ahead of them, the horizon opening up gray and vast beyond the last line of wind-bent pines. "Get me General Marchetti, and get the coastal evacuation sirens live in every township inside a 30-kilometer radius. Now, don't wait for confirmation. We do not get a second warning if this is real. Already moving on it. Command's going to want to know why we've got 2 unregistered individuals walking straight into the exclusion zone the second we set one. Tell them the truth. Tell them we tried to stop them and I don't think physics agreed with the plan. The fishing village of Otsuchihama sat in a shallow curve of bay, 40-some houses and a handful of boats pulled up on a gray sand beach, smoke already rising from a few chimneys as the morning properly began, until the sirens started, first one, then a cascading chain of them up and down the coast, and the smoke was joined, within minutes, by the sound of doors banging open and voices calling names across narrow lanes. Saitama and Genos crested the last rise above the village just as the evacuation began in earnest, and Saitama slowed to a stop at the sight of it. Not out of hesitation, Elaine would realize later, watching the drone footage back, but because something about the scene had actually caught his attention for the first time since he'd arrived. An old woman being half carried, half guided up a lane by two younger relatives. A father sprinting back into a house for a child's shoes. A fisherman standing frozen at his boat, torn between saving it and saving himself. The particular anguish of a man watching his livelihood become expendable in real time. "This happens a lot?" Saitama asked, when Elaine's truck finally caught up and skidded to a stop on the gravel above the beach. "More than it should," Elaine said, climbing out, scanning the bay with binoculars that suddenly felt inadequate to the moment. "These people live with this. Every alert, every tremor, not knowing if it's nothing or if it's this. Doesn't seem right," Saitama said, quiet, almost to himself, watching the fisherman finally abandon his boat and run. "Living like that?" Something in his tone had changed, not dramatically, not into anything Elaine could have pointed to and named, but there was a stillness to him now that hadn't been there in the clearing, a focus that made Genos, standing a half step behind him, go quiet, in a way that suggested he recognized it too. Then the water changed color. It happened the way it always did, according to every account Elaine had ever read or personally witnessed. Not a wave, not initially, but a deep displacement. The ocean surface bulging upward in a swell that had no business existing in water that shallow. A boil of white foam breaking around a shape still submerged, still building. The bay itself seeming to hold its breath the way the gulls had that morning at the outpost. The temperature dropped. The air took on a mineral, ozone tang that Elaine's body remembered even faster than her mind did. Muscle memory built from 3 prior confirmed sightings, each one worse than the last. "There," Bernie's voice crackled over her radio, tight with something between vindication and dread. "Elaine, that's him. Confirmed visual inbound, Otsuchihama, get your people back." The dorsal spines broke the surface first, a jagged crown of bone cresting through white water in a line that ran the length of a city block. And then the head came up behind it, vast and ancient and utterly without hurry, seawater sheeting off scales the color of old iron, and the roar that followed didn't so much arrive as arrive inside people, a bone-deep bass pressure that rattled the truck's windows and sent every remaining bird on the beach scattering skyward at once. Josh, beside the truck, had gone completely silent, recorder forgotten in his slack hand, staring up at a shape that dwarfed the fishing boats bobbing helplessly in its wake, the way a man dwarfs an ant. Genos's optical sensors flared, running calculations at a speed that made his internal fans whir audibly. "Sensei," he said, voice pitched with something that was, for the first time since the clearing, genuine alarm rather than reflexive caution. "Structural mass estimate places that creature at. The scale doesn't. I need to recalibrate. That cannot be accurate." "It's accurate," Elaine said grimly. 100 meters, give or take, depending which measurement you trust. 90,000 tons of dense, radioactive, regenerative tissue. He can survive ordnance that would level a mountain range. We've watched him take a direct hit from an oxygen destroyer variant and keep standing. She lowered the binoculars, jaw tight. This is the part of the job where I tell you both to get behind the truck and let the response teams handle evacuation, while we figure out if he's actually making landfall or just surfacing to move through. Saitama didn't get behind the truck. He walked down the gravel slope toward the beach instead, unhurried, cabbage-free hands loose at his sides, and Elaine found herself shouting after him with an authority that had worked on decorated military officers and clearly meant absolutely nothing to this man. Saitama, that is not a fight you understand the scale of. I need you to fall back. I get it, he called back, not turning around. Big lizard, 90,000 tons, radioactive. He kept walking, down onto the sand now, past the last abandoned nets and overturned crates, close enough that the wind off the bay carried the mineral tang of Godzilla's presence directly into his face, close enough that any ordinary human would have felt their nerve fail on some animal level, long before conscious thought caught up. You said he's saved people before too. Didn't say he's evil, just said he's dangerous. He is. Elaine struggled for the words, watching in something like helpless horror, as the distance between the man and the monster closed to 100 meters, 50, unpredictable. He doesn't distinguish easily between threat and non-threat at close range, especially not agitated by a dimensional rupture and unfamiliar movement on the shoreline. So I'll be careful, Saitama said, and something in his voice, still flat, still almost bored, had underneath it now a note Elaine hadn't heard from him yet. Attention. Real, focused attention. The kind a man gives something he's actually decided to take seriously, even if his face refused to show it. You said this happens to these people all the time. Every alert, not knowing. He stopped at the tide line, sand and foam washing over his boots, close enough now that Godzilla's massive, ancient eye, slit-pupiled, luminous, older than every nation currently drawing borders on the planet it had outlived generations of, swung slowly, ponderously, to fix on the single small figure standing where nothing should have been standing. That's a crap way to live, Saitama said quietly, to no one in particular, and then he rolled his shoulders once, the small habitual gesture Genos had learned, over months of training sessions, meant everything was about to be over very quickly. Genos, Elaine said, without looking away from the beach, voice gone hoarse. Tell me he's not about to do what I think he's about to do. Genos didn't answer. He was watching his teacher with an expression Elaine hadn't seen on him yet. Not fear, exactly, and not the reflexive alarm from a moment ago, but something closer to awe, the particular awe of a man who had seen this exact stillness precede the end of threats he'd once thought unstoppable, and who understood, better than anyone else on that beach, precisely what was about to happen, and precisely how little it would resemble a fight. Godzilla's massive head lowered, jaw beginning to part, the telltale blue luminescence kindling deep in his throat, dorsal spines igniting in sequence down his spine in the unmistakable, world-ending build-up to an atomic breath attack that had, in recorded history, vaporized mountains. Saitama looked up at 90,000 tons of ancient apex radiation incarnate, leveling the single most devastating weapon on the planet directly at his unarmored, unimpressed face, and said, in the exact tone of a man mildly inconvenienced by a long line at the grocery store, "Yeah, okay." He raised one fist. The blue light in Godzilla's throat built to blinding, the air itself beginning to hum and crack with contained atomic pressure, the entire bay lit gold-white in a corona that threw Saitama's shadow 40 meters up the beach behind him, and Elaine, watching through binoculars with her whole body locked rigid, braced for a devastation she had personally witnessed twice before and had no framework for surviving a third time this close. The beam fired, and it never reached him. What happened next took less than a full second, and every recording device on that beach, Josh's handheld, the outpost's long-range camera array, the drone still hovering at altitude, would later require frame-by-frame breakdown to even partially reconstruct it, because the human eye, unaided, simply could not process motion at that speed and call it motion at all. Saitama's fist met the leading edge of the atomic breath roughly 8 meters from where he stood, and the beam, a stream of raw, sustained thermonuclear energy capable of boiling a harbor and cratering bedrock, didn't so much stop as cease, the blue light collapsing inward on itself and simply winking out, dispersed by a single point of impact into something that resolved, on later analysis, as pure kinetic redirection so absolute it left no residual thermal bloom at all. No steam cloud, no crater, not even scorched sand. Godzilla's roar cut off mid-breath. For one full, suspended second, the entire bay held an unnatural silence. No gulls, no wind, no distant sirens, just the low ambient hiss of settling seawater, and the ragged sound of Josh, somewhere behind Eileen, forgetting to breathe. Then Saitama lowered his fist, rolled his shoulder again like he'd merely stretched, and looked up at the single largest apex predator on the planet, a creature that had, until this exact moment, in the entire recorded and unrecorded history of Monarch's existence, never once had an attack meaningfully interrupted, let alone erased, with an expression that had not changed at all. "Huh," he said. "That's it?" Godzilla did not attack again immediately. His great head canted, slightly, luminous eye narrowing, a reaction Elaine had genuinely never documented before in 3 decades of combined Monarch field data, a hesitation, something that on any other creature she'd have called recalculation. "Eileen," Bernie's voice came through the radio, thin and strange, like a man reading a readout he refused to believe. "Eileen, I need you to confirm something for me, because my instruments are telling me that attack registered 0. I repeat, 0. Measurable output past the point of contact. That's not absorption. That's not deflection. There's no thermal signature anywhere on that beach except what's coming off Godzilla himself." "I see it," Elaine said, and her own voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. "I'm looking right at it, Bernie, and I still don't believe it." Down on the sand, Genos had gone very still, cybernetic frame trembling faintly, with what might have been residual heat shock from proximity to the beam's collapse, or might have simply been the particular tremor of a man watching his teacher do the thing he always did, the thing that had once seemed, even to Genos, impossible to fully comprehend, except this time in front of a creature that outweighed entire buildings, in front of strangers from another world, in front of cameras that would carry this footage to every corner of a planet that had spent 70 years building its entire understanding of power around the idea that some things simply could not be stopped. Genos found his voice, quiet, almost reverent, in the sudden ringing silence of the bay. "He does this," he said, "to no one, to everyone, to Elaine, standing frozen at the top of the gravel slope, with binoculars forgotten in her hands. He always does this." Godzilla, ancient and enormous and, for perhaps the first time in living or fossil memory, genuinely, visibly uncertain, drew back a slow half-step through the churning water, spines dimming from full ignition down to a low, watchful ember glow, and fixed the small bald man on the beach with a stare that held, unmistakably, something Elaine would spend the rest of the day trying to convince her superiors a 90,000-ton radioactive titan was capable of feeling. It looked, for all the world, like caution. Godzilla did not press the attack. For nearly a full minute, an eternity, by the standards of every encounter Eileen had ever catalogued, the titan simply held his position in the shallows, massive head tracking the small figure on the beach with a wary, deliberate patience that had no precedent in Monarch's behavioral files. Then, with a low rumble that vibrated up through the sand and into the soles of everyone's feet. He began, slowly, to withdraw, sinking back beneath the churn of the bay by degrees, spines dimming, until only a long, dark wake remained, curving out toward open water and the deep trench beyond. Nobody on the beach moved until the wake had fully dissolved into ordinary swell. "He left," Josh said, finally, into the ringing quiet, his voice cracking slightly on the second word. He left. He's never done that," Elaine said. She was still holding the binoculars, though she'd long since lowered them, staring instead at the empty water with the particular blankness of a person whose entire professional framework had just quietly, irreversibly cracked. In every recorded engagement, every single one, once he commits to an attack, he presses it until the threat's neutralized or he's driven off by force. He doesn't just reassess and retreat. Maybe he didn't retreat. Bernie's voice crackled over the radio, tighter now, thinking out loud in the way he did when a theory was assembling itself faster than his mouth could keep up. Maybe that's not what we're looking at. You don't back off from something you've already beaten. You back off from something you can't read yet, something you don't have a category for. A pause. "Elaine, I've been doing this a long time, and I'm telling you, that's not fear. Godzilla doesn't do fear. That's caution, and I don't have a single data point in 20 years of field notes that says he's ever needed to be cautious about anything." Down on the sand, Saitama had turned away from the water entirely and was walking back up the beach toward the truck at the same unhurried pace he'd walked down it, hands back in his pockets, expression settled once again into its default flat mildness. Except, Elaine noted, not quite. There was something underneath it now, something she was starting to learn to read in the small margins of his face. Not disappointment exactly, but the particular deflation of a man who'd braced for something and gotten, once again, nothing at all. "That's the strongest thing you've got?" he asked, when he reached her, jerking a thumb back over his shoulder at the empty bay. "That's, Saitama, that's the single most dangerous confirmed entity on this planet. That's not a low bar, that's the entire bar." Elaine found herself, despite everything, laughing. A short, disbelieving huff of air that had nowhere else to go. You just no-sold an attack that's leveled mountain ranges, and you're asking if that's the strongest thing we've got. I mean, yeah, it's a fair question. He looked genuinely, mildly troubled by this, in the specific way he'd looked troubled by the cabbage, the way of a man confronting a small, ongoing disappointment rather than a crisis. "If that's your world's version of unstoppable, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with myself here." Genos, jogging up behind him, cybernetic frame still trembling faintly with residual proximity heat, looked between his teacher and Elaine with an expression caught somewhere between pride and something more complicated, a kind of weary, familiar grief that Elaine would come to recognize over the following days as the particular ache of loving someone whose gift was also, quietly, a kind of prison. "He does this every time," Genos said, quiet enough that Elaine had to lean in to catch it. "Every single time, Sensei. I have watched him hope, just for a moment, right before the fight starts, and I have watched that hope die, the instant it's over, because it's always over instantly. I used to think one day something would finally be enough." He shook his head slowly, optical sensors dimming in something that looked, on a face built mostly of metal, remarkably close to sorrow. "I don't think that day is coming. I think I've made peace with that. I don't think he has." Elaine looked at Saitama, really looked at him, past the flat expression and the cabbage-stained sleeve, and the almost comic mundanity of the whole encounter, and felt something shift in her assessment that had nothing to do with threat level or gravitational anomalies. "You're not disappointed he's not a threat to you," she said slowly, working it out as she said it. You're disappointed nothing is. Saitama didn't answer right away. He looked back out at the water, at the last traces of Godzilla's wake finally smoothing flat under the morning light, and for just a moment, the boredom in his face gave way to something rawer and much smaller. Yeah, he said, something like that. 6,000 kilometers and one very different set of priorities away, in a glass-walled conference room on the top floor of an Apex Cybernetics research tower that officially didn't exist on any public filing, Walter Simmons watched the same footage Elaine's team had just lived through, looping for the fourth time on a wall-sized display, hands folded neatly in his lap, expression giving away absolutely nothing. "Play it again," he said. Maya Simmons, standing at the head of the table with a tablet in one hand, didn't need to be told twice. She'd already watched it a dozen times before bringing it to her father, and each viewing had sharpened rather than dulled the particular hunger in her expression. On screen, the small bald figure raised a single fist. The atomic breath collapsed into nothing. Godzilla retreated. "Where did the footage originate?" Walter asked, when the loop finished for the fifth time. "Field-level intercept from a Monarch drone feed, Western Kyushu. We had a listening post picking up their outpost chatter after the anomaly reading this morning. The gravitational spike registered on half our monitoring network before Monarch even had eyes on it." Maya set the tablet down on the polished table, angling it so the frozen frame, Saitama's raised fist, the beam already dissolving, faced her father directly. Two individuals came through the rupture, Monarchs calling them unregistered anomalous entities. Internally, they're referring to the bald one as, and I'm quoting the field log here, unclear threat classification, priority observation. "That's not what I'm looking at," Walter said quietly. "No," Maya agreed. "It isn't." Walter rose from his chair and crossed to the display, studying the frozen frame the way another man might study a rare stone, turning it over mentally, assessing every facet for value. "For 70 years, he said, every serious actor on this planet has organized itself around a single, foundational assumption, that Godzilla is the ceiling, that whatever we build, whatever we contain, whatever we weaponize, it exists in relation to him, because he is, functionally, the largest variable any of us have ever had to plan around." He tapped the screen, once, at the small figure standing unarmed on the beach. This man just demonstrated, in front of cameras, in under 1 second, that the ceiling was never fixed. It was just untested. "You want him," Maya said. It wasn't a question. "I want to understand him." Walter turned back to face her, and there was something in his calm, reasonable voice that made even his own daughter go very slightly still. The particular stillness of someone who'd learned, over years of watching her father operate, to recognize the exact register his voice took on, right before a decision that would reshape a division's entire mission statement. Monarch will try to study him carefully, slowly, with all the ethical hand-wringing that's cost this company 2 of its best acquisitions in the last decade alone. We are not going to make that mistake again. He looked back at the screen. Find out everything. Where he came from, what he's made of, whether that strength is replicable, transferable, scalable. If there is a version of Apex's Titan parody program that doesn't require us to build another Mecha Godzilla from scratch, I want to know today, not after Monarch's finished being careful. Maya was already reaching for her tablet again, composing instructions with the particular efficiency that had made her, at 34, the person her father trusted more than any board member. And if Monarch gets protective, if they decide he's a person and not an asset, then we'll remind them, Walter said, mild as ever, that the last time this company decided a Titan was an asset worth acquiring, we very nearly ended the world, and everyone involved somehow still has a job. He straightened his jacket, the closest thing to humor he allowed himself in a room like this one. Progress requires a short memory, Maya. I intend to make good use of ours. By the time Elaine's convoy made it back to the outpost, the base had transformed. What had been a quiet three-person field station that morning was now humming with the controlled chaos of an escalating incident. Extra personnel rerouted from the regional command post 2 hours south. A secure line opened directly to General Marchetti's office, and Bernie, hunched over 3 monitors at once, running the beach footage against every database Monarch had ever compiled with the manic focus of a man who'd finally found something worth being paranoid about. "They're calling a full briefing," Bernie said, without looking up, the moment Elaine walked through the door. "Marchetti wants eyes on this by end of day, and I mean all the eyes. Pentagon liaison, the UN observation seat, probably half the alphabet soup agencies that only show up when something's genuinely gone sideways." He finally glanced up, and his expression was somewhere between vindicated and deeply unsettled. "And, for the record, I already caught chatter suggesting Apex has the footage too. Wouldn't put money on how." "Of course they do," Elaine said, dropping into the chair across from him, exhaustion catching up to her all at once, now that the adrenaline had nowhere left to go. "It's Apex. They probably had it before we finished processing the drone feed." Behind her, Saitama had wandered to the window overlooking the bay, cabbage bag retrieved from the log where he'd left it and now sitting, slightly wilted, on the table beside him, and Genos stood near the door in the rigid, watchful posture of a man cataloging every exit and entry point out of long habit. "So what happens now?" Saitama asked, not turning around. Elaine rubbed her eyes. "Now, a lot of very powerful people spend the next several hours arguing about what you are, what you mean for global security doctrine, and what Monarch's supposed to do about the fact that the single most dangerous entity on the planet just backed off from a fight for the first time in recorded history." She looked at him. Really looked, the way she had on the beach, and something in her settled into a decision she hadn't fully realized she'd been building toward. "Some of them are going to want to contain you, study you. Some of them are going to want to weaponize whatever it is you can do. I'd bet real money at least one faction's already trying to figure out how to get to you before the rest of us finish our coffee." "They can try," Genos said, low and flat, in a tone that made even Bernie glance up from his monitors. "I believe you," Elaine said, "but I'd rather it not come to that. I'd rather figure out, together, what happens next. Because whatever you two are, wherever you came from, you didn't ask for any of this. You went out for cabbage." A tired, genuine half-smile crossed her face despite everything. "The least this world owes you is a say in what happens now that you're stuck in it." Saitama turned from the window, and for the first time since the tier had opened over the Z-City crosswalk, something in his expression looked less like boredom and more like the faint, cautious shape of actual interest. "You said this Godzilla guy saves people sometimes," he said. "That true? It's true. Complicated, but true. And the ones who want to catch me, or use me, or whatever, they'd be doing that instead of dealing with the actual monsters. The ones your people are scared of. Some of them, yes." Saitama considered this for a long moment, weighing it with the same careful, oddly earnest attention he'd given the discount cabbage that morning. A lifetime ago now, though it had been less than 12 hours. "That's a dumb way to spend your time," he said finally, "when there's real problems that need solving." He glanced at Genos, some private understanding passing between them. "Guess we're sticking around a while then. Might as well be useful." Outside the window, the bay lay flat and gray and deceptively calm, and far beneath its surface, in the cold dark of the trench he called home, Godzilla settled into stillness for the first time in decades, with something coiled and unresolved in the ancient architecture of his mind. The ember memory of a single small figure who had not run, had not begged, had not even flinched, and had simply, absolutely, made the fight not happen at all. The briefing convened at 1400 hours in a secure conference room 3 floors below Monarch's regional command post, and by the time Elaine walked in, escorting Saitama and Genos past a security checkpoint that had visibly struggled to process how to badge a man with no travel history in any system on Earth, the room was already at capacity. 11 people around a table built for 8, 3 more standing along the back wall, and a video feed patched in from a location Elaine wasn't cleared to know. General Frank Marchetti sat at the head of the table, a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s whose career had been built, almost entirely, on the specific discipline of not panicking in front of subordinates, even when panic was, privately, the only reasonable response. He'd read the incident report twice before the meeting started. He read it a third time now, silently, while the room settled. "Dr. Andrews," he said without looking up, "walk me through it. Not the report, what you actually saw." Elaine had rehearsed this on the drive over, stripped it down to the essentials, and still, it felt inadequate the moment she started speaking. At approximately 0847 local time, Godzilla surfaced in Otsuchihama Bay, consistent with the deep-water resonance pattern we'd flagged an hour prior. He engaged what he likely read as an anomalous threat on the shoreline, the individual known as Saitama, with a full atomic breath discharge. The attack did not connect. It was interrupted, mid-discharge, by unarmed physical contact and dispersed without any measurable thermal, kinetic, or radiological aftermath. Godzilla then disengaged and withdrew to deep water without further escalation. She paused, aware of how clinical the words sounded set against what she'd actually watched happen. In 3 decades of combined Monarch field data, we have no precedent for that outcome. None. A colonel near the far end of the table. Elaine recognized him vaguely from a joint command exercise 2 years prior, name tag reading Hendricks, leaned forward. "With respect, Doctor, no thermal aftermath isn't a category. Either the attack was deflected, in which case the energy went somewhere, or it was absorbed, in which case there should be residual signature in the subject's biology. What are we actually saying happened?" "We're saying," Bernie cut in, from his seat near the wall monitors, "that our instruments recorded an attack releasing 0 joules of dispersed energy after the point of contact. Not redirected, not absorbed. 0. I've run it 4 times. I don't have a mechanism that explains that, and neither does anyone else in this room, and I'd be very careful about anyone who tells you they do, because right now the honest answer is that we watched something happen that our current models say shouldn't be possible." Marchetti's eyes moved, for the first time, to Saitama, who was sitting near the back of the room, in a chair slightly too small for the general indifference with which he occupied it, one leg crossed over the other, listening to the entire exchange, with the mild attention of a man half watching a television left on in another room. "You want to explain it to us yourself," Marchetti said. It wasn't quite a request. Saitama shrugged. "I punched it before it hit me. That's it. Not really more to explain. You punched an atomic energy discharge. I punched the air in front of it technically. It stopped being a problem after that." He considered this. "I don't really know the physics. I just know it works." Hendricks and 2 others exchanged a look that Elaine recognized instantly. The specific, weary skepticism of career military officers confronted with a claim too simple to be taken seriously, and too well documented to be dismissed. "Forgive me," Hendricks said, "but that's not an explanation. That's a magic trick." "Colonel," Elaine said, sharper than she intended. "I was standing 80 meters away. I watched it happen in real time before I saw a single frame of footage. Whatever this is, it's not a trick." Genos, who had been standing silent and rigid near the door since they'd entered, finally spoke, his voice carrying the flat, formal certainty of a man reciting something he'd said many times before and never once seen disproven. Sensei has never lost a fight, not one, in the years I've known him, not to threats that leveled cities, not to enemies that ended civilizations in his world's own histories. I understand this sounds like exaggeration. I assure you it is not. I have built my understanding of what strength means around watching him render it irrelevant, over and over. And I have stopped expecting that pattern to break. A pause, something almost bitter creeping into the mechanical precision of his tone. If your Godzilla is the strongest thing this world has, I would advise you to start planning around the possibility that it no longer is. The room went very quiet. It was Marchetti who broke the silence, leaning back slowly in his chair, jaw working through something Elaine suspected was closer to dread than the calm professional mask suggested. "Say that's true," he said. "Say it's exactly what it looks like. What does Monarch's doctrine even mean anymore, if the ceiling we've spent 70 years building policy around just got walked past by a man who showed up looking for discount vegetables?" Nobody answered right away, and Elaine understood, watching the room, that the silence wasn't reluctance. It was the specific vertigo of a dozen very experienced people realizing, together, in real time, that every containment protocol, every deterrence framework, every classified contingency plan built around Godzilla as the fixed variable in an equation had just quietly stopped being reliable, and none of them had the faintest idea yet what should replace it. The meeting fractured, as these things did, into smaller conversations the moment it officially ended. Marchetti pulling Elaine and two senior analysts aside for a closed-door follow-up. Hendricks and his people retreating to argue containment logistics that would, Elaine suspected, prove almost comically irrelevant against a man who'd shrugged off a full atomic breath discharge. And Josh cornering Bernie near the coffee station with the particular manic energy of a man whose entire worldview had just been rebuilt from the studs up. "We need to talk about what this means for classification protocol," Josh said, low, urgent. "Because right now he's filed under unregistered anomalous entity, same bucket as every unconfirmed cryptid report we've ever logged. And that is not, Bernie, that is not an adequate bucket for a man who just no-sold Godzilla." "I'm aware," Bernie muttered, not looking up from his tablet. "I'm aware. I've been aware since about 8:50 this morning. And I'll tell you what else I'm aware of. Apex had eyes on that footage inside the hour. That's not standard lag time on a leaked drone feed. That's a live intercept on our secure channel, which means somebody in this building, or close enough to it, is feeding them real time." He finally looked up, and his usual paranoid energy had sharpened into something colder, more focused. "I've flagged it up the chain twice already. Nobody wants to hear it, because nobody wants another internal leak investigation on top of everything else today. But mark it. Apex isn't behind on this. They're already moving." Across the room, Saitama had found the vending machine and was studying its contents with the same careful, unbothered scrutiny he'd given the cabbage that morning, entirely uninterested in the fact that he'd just become the single most classified subject in a room full of people cleared for material most nations didn't know existed. "You want something?" he asked Genos, without turning around. "I do not require sustenance, Sensei. I know you don't need it. I asked if you want it." Genos's optical sensors flickered, the particular small warmth that crossed his face only around Saitama, never around anyone else. "I would not object to the rice crackers." Elaine, catching the exchange from across the room while half listening to Marchetti's aide brief her on next steps, felt something in her chest loosen slightly despite the weight of the day. A small, human moment threaded through the middle of a crisis that had, in the span of 6 hours, upended 7 decades of strategic doctrine. Whatever else these two were, whatever storm they'd inadvertently opened in a world that had barely begun learning to survive its own monsters, they were also, unmistakably, still just two people trying to look out for each other in a place that made no sense to them yet. She was still holding on to that thought when Marchetti's aide returned, expression carefully neutral in the way that meant the news underneath it was not. Dr. Andrews, General wants you back in. Now. Apex has formally requested access to the subject. A pause. Through diplomatic channels. Which means somebody above Marchetti's pay grade already has a call to make, and he wants your read on it before he makes his. Elaine closed her eyes briefly, feeling the day's weight settle fully onto her shoulders for the first time. Tell him I'm coming. She glanced back once, at Saitama contemplating the vending machine's snack selection with total unhurried focus. At Genos, accepting a bag of rice crackers with something that looked, on a face built mostly of metal and old grief, remarkably close to contentment. Two people who had, 12 hours ago, been standing in a grocery store line arguing about cabbage prices, and who now sat, without asking for any of it, at the exact center of a fight neither government, nor corporation, nor monster had any intention of losing gracefully. This is going to get complicated fast, she murmured to herself, and went to find out exactly how fast. General Marchetti's office was smaller than the briefing room, which somehow made the pressure in it feel larger. A single window looking out over the Coastal Command Post satellite array. A desk cluttered with more paper than a man of his rank should still be handling personally, and Elaine standing across from him with her arms crossed, waiting for him to finish reading the formal request a second time. Apex is calling it a research liaison request, Marchetti said finally, sliding the tablet across the desk toward her. Couched in exactly enough diplomatic language that it'll look reasonable if it leaks to a committee. Joint assessment of anomalous entity capabilities in the interest of coordinated global defense readiness. He said the phrase like it left a bad taste, which is Walter Simmons for, give us access before Monarch figures out what he's worth. Elaine scanned the document, already knowing what she'd find. This came in less than 5 hours after the incident. That's not a request built through proper channels. That's a request built on stolen footage, and a head start we should be furious about instead of debating. I am furious about it. I'm also being told, from 2 levels above me, that Apex holds enough defense contracts and enough goodwill from the last administration that an outright refusal needs better justification than, we don't like them. Marchetti rubbed the bridge of his nose, the gesture of a man who'd spent the last hour on calls he clearly hadn't enjoyed. Give me something better than that, Elaine. Give me a reason grounded in actual doctrine, not instinct, and I'll fight this all the way up the chain. Elaine set the tablet down and thought, for a moment, not about doctrine but about the vending machine, about Genos accepting a bag of rice crackers with quiet, guarded gratitude, about the particular loyalty in his voice when he'd said Sensei has never lost a fight like it was both the truest thing he knew and the saddest. He's not an asset, she said finally. He's not a titan we tranquilize and study in a containment bay, and he's not ordnance we reverse engineer. He's a person who showed up here by accident, who's already expressed a willingness to work with us rather than be handled by us. And if Monarch's entire founding premise is that we're the organization that tries to understand these situations with some baseline of ethics intact, however badly we've failed at that in the past, then handing him to Apex the same day he arrived is exactly the kind of decision this organization has had to spend years cleaning up after. She met Marchetti's eyes. You asked for doctrine, that's it. We don't get to claim any moral high ground over what happened with Mecha Godzilla, with the Hollow Earth program, with any of it, if we turn around and do the exact same thing to a person the first chance a corporation asks nicely. Marchetti was quiet for a long moment, turning that over. And if he doesn't want to work with us either? If he decides he'd rather just walk away from both of us? Then that's his call to make, not ours. And definitely not Apex's. Elaine straightened. Let me talk to him. Properly. Not a debrief. An actual conversation about what he wants out of this, before anyone else in this building starts drafting containment logistics, like he's a specimen instead of a witness who happened to also be capable of ending a Titan encounter with one punch. Marchetti studied her for a beat, then nodded slowly, some of the tension easing out of his shoulders, not because the problem was solved, but because he'd found, in her, someone willing to actually own the harder call. You've got until end of day before I have to give the chain an answer. Make it count. She found Saitama and Genos exactly where she'd left them, in the small break room off the main corridor, except now they'd been joined by Josh, who had apparently decided that the appropriate use of an unprecedented first contact situation was to explain, at length and with visible enthusiasm, the entire 70-year history of Godzilla's public and classified appearances, complete with hand-drawn timeline on the whiteboard, usually reserved for shift schedules. And that's the thing people don't get about the 90s stuff, right? Everyone focuses on the big spectacle events, but there's this whole undercurrent of Monarch actually protecting him in some of these. Josh stopped mid-sentence when Eileen walked in, straightening with the guilty haste of a man caught doing something he'd been explicitly told not to do, several times, by several people. I was just context, historical context, very relevant to their situation. Josh, out. Yep, going. He gathered his marker with theatrical speed and slid past her into the corridor. Elaine closed the door behind him and pulled a chair around, sitting across from Saitama instead of standing over him, a small deliberate choice she'd learned mattered in situations like this, that the geometry of a conversation said as much as the words in it. Genos remained standing near the wall, watchful as always, though something in his posture had eased slightly over the course of the day, the reflexive vigilance dialing down by fractions as the environment failed, hour after hour, to produce a threat. I want to talk to you honestly, she said, not as a briefing, not for a report. Just, honestly. Saitama, mid-bite of a rice cracker he'd apparently claimed from Genos's bag, raised an eyebrow. Okay. There's a company called Apex Cybernetics. They build advanced technology, some of it defense-related, some of it, historically, built directly off captured or studied Titan biology. They've formally requested access to you. Officially, it's framed as research cooperation. Unofficially, based on how fast they moved and how they got the footage in the first place, I think they see you as the single biggest opportunity this planet has produced since the discovery of Hollow Earth. And I think if they get their hands on you, cooperation is not going to stay voluntary for very long. She held his gaze. I don't have the authority to promise you protection from that. I have influence, and I intend to use every bit of it. But I want you to understand the actual stakes before anyone else in this building tries to spin them for you. Saitama chewed slowly, considering this with more visible weight than he'd given almost anything else that day. They want to, what? Cut me open? Figure out how I work? Some version of that, eventually, if they think it'll get them what they want. They might start gentler. Tests, observation, cooperation, framed as mutual benefit. But companies like Apex have a track record, and it does not end with gentle. Elaine chose her next words carefully. I won't lie to you and say Monarch's hands are clean either. We've made our own mistakes with power we didn't fully understand. But I can tell you that right now, in this building, there are people, myself included, who think you're a person first and a phenomenon second, and who are willing to fight for that distinction to actually mean something. Genos, from the wall, spoke quietly. In our world, there is an organization, the Hero Association, that ranks Sensei's strength based on paperwork and bureaucratic process, rather than what he actually does. He is currently ranked far below where his power warrants, not because anyone doubts his ability, but because the system that measures him was never built to properly see him. A pause. something bitter creeping back into his voice. I would ask that this world not make the same mistake in the opposite direction, seeing him too clearly, and deciding that clarity makes him property. Elaine absorbed that, and something in her chest tightened at the parallel. A hero undervalued by one broken system, about to become overvalued, in the worst way, by another. That's exactly what I'm trying to prevent, she said. But I need to know what you want, Saitama. Not what Monarch wants, not what Apex wants. You. Saitama set the rice cracker bag down and looked at her for a long moment. Something working behind the flat, tired eyes that had, over the course of one very strange day, started to show her more than she suspected he meant to. I didn't ask for any of this, he said finally. The rift, the monster, the company that wants to cut me open, any of it. All I wanted this morning was cheap cabbage, a short, humorless breath that might have been a laugh in another lifetime. But I've been doing the hero thing long enough to know what happens when people like that company get their hands on something strong before anyone stops to ask if it's a person. It doesn't end well for the person. He looked at Genos, some old private history passing between them that Elaine wasn't privy to and didn't ask about. I'm not going to let that happen, not to me, not to him. A pause, and then, quieter. And if this world's got a fight coming, the kind that actually needs someone, I'd rather be standing where I can help than locked in some lab getting studied like a bug. So you're saying no to Apex? I'm saying no to anybody who thinks yes isn't mine to give. He met her eyes squarely, and for a moment, the boredom was entirely gone, replaced by something quieter and more resolute. You've been straight with me today, more than I expected from a guy. Sorry. A world I fell into by accident. I'll work with you. Not because Monarch owns me, because you asked, and you meant it when you asked. Elaine felt something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight since the moment the gravitational sensors overloaded that morning. Okay, she said. Then that's what I'll tell Marchetti. And I'll tell Apex myself, if it comes to it. It'll come to it, Genos said quietly, with the flat certainty of a man who had, in his own world, watched exactly this kind of ambition play out before, and knew precisely how patient the people who wanted power tended to be when patience served their ends. They will not simply accept no. Companies like the one you describe rarely do. Elaine thought of Maya Simmons, a name she knew only by reputation, sharp and relentlessly effective, the kind of person who treated no as a data point to route around rather than an answer to respect, and knew, with a settling certainty of her own, that Genos was almost certainly right. Then we'll be ready when it comes to it, she said, and stood, extending a hand that Saitama, after a beat of visible surprise at the formality, shook. Welcome to Monarch, unofficially. I can't promise it'll be simple. I can promise it won't be boring. For the first time since the rift had torn open over a Z-City crosswalk, something that might, almost, have been the beginning of a real smile crossed Saitama's face. We'll see, he said. Boring's kind of my whole problem. 6 floors up, in a different building entirely, Maya Simmons closed the secure call with her Kyushu contact and turned to find her father already watching her from the doorway of her office, patient as ever, hands folded behind his back. Well? Walter asked. Monarch's declining the liaison request. Formally, through channels, with language careful enough that walking it back later will be difficult without looking like we forced it. Maya's expression didn't shift, though something in her tone sharpened. Dr. Andrews got to him first, convinced him he's a person, not an asset, which is charming and also entirely beside the point, because personhood was never going to be the thing that stopped us. Walter's expression remained mild, unbothered, the particular calm of a man for whom a closed door had never once been the same thing as a locked one. Then we find another door, he said. Every asset has a price, Maya, even the ones that don't know they're for sale yet. Find out what he actually wants, out of whatever world he's stranded in. Money means nothing to a man who no-sold Godzilla, but there's always something. A way home, perhaps. Protection for someone he cares about. Leverage isn't about force. It's about finding the thing a person can't say no to, and offering it before anyone else thinks to. Maya allowed herself, for the first time since the footage had first come across her desk that morning, something close to a smile. I'll start with the cyborg, she said. He's the one who talks. The days that followed settled into a rhythm nobody at the outpost quite had a name for. Not the disciplined choreography of a standard Monarch operation, and not the chaos of the first day either, but something stranger, built around the fact that two people from another world were now, functionally, living in a converted storage annex behind the main command building, and the world had not yet decided what to do about that. Elaine had pushed hard for exactly this outcome: housing rather than holding, cooperation rather than containment, and had won the argument only by putting her own name on every line of the resulting protocol, which meant she was, more often than not, the first person Saitama and Genos saw in the morning, and the last one they saw before the annex lights went dark at night. It was on the fourth morning, over instant coffee, that Saitama had declared, "Fine, I guess," and Genos didn't drink at all, that Josh came sprinting across the compound with the particular breathless energy of a man who'd found something that couldn't wait for a proper meeting. "We've got activity," he said, badge still swinging from his lanyard, laptop clutched to his chest. "Not Godzilla, something else. Kyushu's southern coast, about 200 kilometers down from here. Fishing trawler reported something breaking the surface at dawn. Description doesn't match anything we've got cataloged for the region." Elaine set down her coffee. "Description. Wings. Big ones. Witnesses are saying it screamed before it submerged again. And I mean screamed, not roared. High frequency. Distressed sounding. One of the trawler crew swears it looked hurt." Josh pulled up a shaky photo on his laptop, grainy and half obscured by spray, but unmistakably a vast membranous wing breaking the surface of gray water, before vanishing again beneath the swell. Bernie's cross-referencing now, but preliminary read says this doesn't match any confirmed Titan in the regional catalog, which either means it's something dormant we've never had eyes on, or it followed the rift, Genos said quietly, from where he stood near the annex door, and the room went still. Elaine looked at him sharply. "You think something came through with you?" "I don't know," Genos admitted. "But Sensei and I were not the only anomaly registered that morning. Your own sensors flagged two seams, did they not? One local, one—" He paused, searching for the word Bernie had used. "Unstitched. Elsewhere." Bernie, arriving mid-sentence with his tablet already open, nodded grimly. "He's right. I flagged it that first day, and then the whole Godzilla situation buried it under a mountain of higher priority chaos. But yeah, there was a second resonance signature, off-catalog, that we never fully traced. I chalked it up to echo distortion from the primary rupture. I might have been wrong. So something else came through," Elaine said slowly. "From their world, or from somewhere else the rift touched. And it's hurt, and it's scared, and it's currently 200 kilometers down the coast from a fishing village that has no idea what's about to swim past their nets." "I want to see it," Saitama said, already standing, Cabbage Day mildness entirely gone from his posture now, replaced by the same quiet, focused attention Elaine had first seen on the beach. "That's not Saitama. We don't even know what it is yet. Could be a Titan. We've simply never cataloged. Could be something from your world entirely. Could be neither. Which is exactly why I want to see it before your people decide it's a threat and start shooting." His flat gaze found hers, steady. You said Godzilla saved people before, when nobody expected it. Maybe this thing's the same. Maybe it's just hurt and scared and about to get killed by people who don't know any better. I'd rather find out first. Genos was already moving toward the door, thrusters warming with their familiar low orange glow. I concur, Sensei. If something followed us through that rift, we bear some responsibility for what happens to it here. Elaine looked between them, weighing protocol against the plain, uncomfortable truth that every instinct she'd built over a decade in this field was telling her the same thing Saitama's was, that whatever had come through that second scene deserved, at minimum, to be understood before it was judged.
Fine, she said, already reaching for the radio.
But we do this my way. Observation first. Containment only if it turns genuinely hostile. And nobody, and I mean nobody, engages without my say-so. She fixed Saitama with a look that had, over 4 days, gained a weight it hadn't carried on that first morning, including you. Something that might have been the ghost of amusement crossed his face. No promises. Saitama, fine, I'll try. The coastal road south ran along cliffs that dropped, in places, sheer into churning gray water, and Josh drove it with the particular grim focus of a man who'd learned, over one very long week, that speed limits were negotiable when the alternative was arriving after whatever was happening had already finished happening. Bernie rode shotgun, tablet balanced on his knees, running live sensor data against every partial match his databases could produce, and finding, with each passing kilometer, fewer and fewer good options. Wingspan estimates coming in high, he said, tension climbing into his voice. Real high. If the trawler crew's measurements are even close to accurate, we're talking something in the same general size range as… He stopped himself. Say it, Elaine said. From the back seat, Saitama and Genos beside her, the annex-issue truck straining slightly under the additional weight of a passenger, who technically registered, on every scale Monarch owned, as denser than his frame should allow. Mothra, Bernie said. I'm talking about Mothra scale, and before anybody gets excited, I want to be clear that we have 0 confirmed activity from her in this hemisphere in over 4 years. Which means either this is an entirely different flying entity, or something's happened to draw her out of dormancy. And given the timing, Elaine finished. It's connected to the rift. They crested the final rise above the fishing village of Samaura just as the first siren started, and the scene below told its own story before anyone said a word. Boats scattering from open water toward the harbor in a ragged, panicked line, and out past the breakers, low against the swell, a vast shape struggling against the water. Wings, enormous, patterned in faded, dust-colored scales that should have shimmered and didn't, beating weakly, uselessly, against a surface that seemed determined to swallow whatever strength remained in them. She's drowning, Genos said. Sensors locked on the shape with sudden, sharp clarity. Sensei, that creature is drowning. Elaine was already out of the truck, binoculars up, watching a wing crest the water and slap down again, weaker each time, the great insectoid head barely breaking the surface long enough to draw breath before submerging again beneath its own failing weight. That's not aggression, she said, half to herself, half into the radio already crackling with Marchetti's voice demanding a sit-rep. That's exhaustion. Whatever she went through to get here, she's spent. Saitama was already moving toward the cliff edge, and this time Elaine didn't call after him to stop, because some instinct 4 days in the making told her, with quiet certainty, that this was exactly the kind of moment he'd been waiting for since the second the beam collapsed against his fist, and Godzilla swam away, leaving him disappointed rather than tested. Not a fight, a rescue. Genos, Saitama said, already gauging the distance down to the water, voice dropping into the low, focused register that meant everything else in the world had stopped mattering. "Keep the boats back! I've got her!" He stepped off the cliff without another word, and Elaine, watching him fall, not scream, not flail, just fall, calm and utterly unafraid, toward gray water and a dying creature the size of a cathedral, understood, with sudden and total clarity, that whatever doctrine Monarch rebuilt itself around in the wake of this week, it was going to have to make room for a kind of hero the world had simply never had a category for before. The fall took less than 2 seconds, and Elaine watched it through binoculars with her heart lodged somewhere in her throat, despite 4 days of mounting evidence that Saitama did not fall the way other people fell. No scramble, no flailing correction, just a controlled, almost lazy descent, jumpsuit snapping in the wind, until he broke the water's surface in a spray that barely registered against the churn already thrown up by the dying creature's struggling wings. "Sensei doesn't need rescue," Genos said, at her shoulder, though there was tension in his voice that suggested he was reassuring himself as much as anyone else. "But the creature does. He'll need to be gentle. That's not always his strong suit." "Comforting," Elaine muttered, radio pressed to her ear, already redirecting the frantic boat traffic away from the impact zone before some well-meaning fisherman got caught in whatever happened next. Beneath the surface, the water pressure meant nothing to Saitama the way it would have to any other body caught in it. No burning lungs, no disorientation, no instinct screaming for air he didn't strictly need in the first place, and he opened his eyes to a gray-green murk, lit faintly by the ambient light, filtering down from the storm-dulled sky above, and found, hanging suspended in that murk, a creature that made even his flat, well-worn indifference falter for half a second. She was enormous, easily the size of the fishing trawlers scattered above, wings, patterned in what should have been vivid, dust gold scaling, hanging limp and waterlogged against a body that trembled with the specific, exhausted tremor of something that had been fighting for its life for far longer than it had strength left to fight. Her great compound eyes, dimmed and unfocused, tracked him without real recognition, the antennae along her head twitching in slow, labored pulses. He didn't hesitate. He crossed the distance in a single kick, wrapped both arms as far around her thorax as they'd reach, which wasn't far, not against something this size, but it was enough, and drove upward, water tearing away from them both in a column of churned white foam that broke the surface with a violence that sent every remaining boat scrambling further back toward shore. The scream she let out when she breached, that same high, distressed shriek Josh's witnesses had described, cut across the bay and rattled windows in Samura, half a kilometer inland. But underneath the pain in it, Elaine, watching through binoculars with her whole body gone rigid, thought she heard something else. Relief. Saitama half-carried, half-dragged the massive, waterlogged creature toward the shallows near a stretch of empty beach south of the harbor, wings dragging furrows through the surf behind them, until her body finally settled, grounded, on wet sand, too weak to hold herself upright, too large for him to do more than steady her collapse rather than prevent it. "Hey," he said, standing over her, soaked through, entirely unbothered by the fact that he'd just single-handedly hauled a creature the mass of a commercial jetliner out of open ocean. "You're on land. You're okay." She didn't understand him, couldn't have by any conventional measure, and yet something in her trembling stilled, fractionally, at the low, steady presence beside her, the great compound eyes tracking him with something that had shifted, subtly, from panic into wary, exhausted attention. Genos reached them at a dead sprint down the beach, Elaine and Bernie close behind, and skidded to a stop several meters off, sensors already cycling through every scan his frame could manage. "Biological readings are consistent with severe exhaustion and dehydration, not injury," he reported. voice tight with the particular focus he brought to anything involving his teacher's safety, even secondhand. There's residual dimensional resonance in her cellular structure, the same signature as the rift. Sensei, I believe she came through with us. Or shortly after. From our world? Saitama asked, crouching beside the massive, heaving thorax, one hand resting lightly against warm, damp scale, in a gesture too gentle to belong to the same man who'd once erased an atomic breath attack, without visibly straining. I don't recognize her, Genos said slowly. She doesn't match any creature catalogued from our world. I believe. He glanced at Elaine, working through an unfamiliar hypothesis carefully. I believe the rift may not have connected only our two worlds. If it tore between dimensions broadly, rather than along a single seam, it's possible she came from somewhere else entirely. A third point. Elaine, arriving finally at the water's edge, stared up at the creature's exhausted, massive form with the dawning, vertiginous understanding of someone watching a single day's crisis quietly become something much larger. Bernie, she said, without looking away, run every physiological marker you can pull off her against Mothra's catalogued profile. I need to know if this is a variant we've never seen, or something that isn't from our world's Titan lineage at all. Already on it, Bernie said, tablet out, hands slightly unsteady. For what it's worth, visually, structurally, she's close enough to Mothra's known profile that I'd bet on convergent origin, some deep evolutionary kinship even if she's not our Mothra. Which raises a question I really don't want to be the one asking out loud. Ask it anyway. If the rift tore wide enough to pull in something Mothra adjacent from a third point of origin, Bernie said, what else might be currently swimming, flying, or crawling toward a coastline somewhere on this planet that we haven't gotten eyes on yet? Nobody answered right away, the question settling over the beach with the particular weight of a problem that had just, silently, tripled in scope. Saitama, still crouched beside the exhausted creature, didn't seem particularly moved by the strategic implications. He was watching her breathing steady, fractionally, beneath his hand, the great trembling wings finally settling flat against wet sand, instead of thrashing weakly at nothing. She's scared, he said quietly, mostly to himself. Whatever world she came from, wherever she ended up, she got dragged through something she didn't choose, dropped somewhere she doesn't recognize, and everybody who saw her landed just assumed she was a monster and ran. He looked up at Elaine, something steady and certain in his gaze that hadn't been there 4 days ago, back when disappointment was still the loudest thing in him. That's not on her. That's just bad luck and worse timing. I know, Elaine said quietly. So what happens to her now? Same deal Apex wanted with me? Cage her, study her, figure out if she's useful. Not if I have anything to say about it, Elaine said, and meant it with a firmness that surprised even her. But Saitama, I need you to understand something. A creature this size, unregistered, unpredictable, connected to an active dimensional anomaly. There are people in this chain of command who are going to see exactly what Apex saw in you, an opportunity. And there are others who are simply going to see a threat too large to risk, whatever her intentions actually are. She held his gaze. If we're going to protect her the way I fought to protect you, I need proof this week that she's not a danger. Real proof. Because doctrine bends slowly, and it bends slower for something with wings that size, and no way to communicate. Genos, still scanning, went suddenly very still. Dr. Andrews, he said, I'm detecting a low-frequency emission from her. Cyclical, patterned, not distress. It reads almost like song. Bernie finished, staring at his own readout with something between awe and unease. That's, Mothra's known for that. Telepathic resonance, sometimes carried on sound. If she's got even a partial version of that capability. She's trying to talk to us, Saitama said, and something in his tone had gone unusually careful, unusually attentive, the flat boredom entirely absent now. Or, to me, I don't know which. The great compound eyes, no longer dimmed, no longer unfocused, had fixed on him, only him, with a steadiness that felt, to everyone standing on that beach, less like animal instinct and more like the first deliberate act of recognition from a mind far more present than any of them had assumed possible. Elaine reached slowly for her radio, already composing, in her head, the impossible briefing she was about to have to deliver to Marchetti. A second entity, possibly sapient, possibly telepathic, arrived through the same rift that had brought Saitama and Genos into their world, currently forming what looked, unmistakably, like the first fragile thread of trust, with the one person on the planet capable of standing between her and anyone who might decide she was worth more contained than free. "Bernie," she said quietly, "tell Command we're going to need a much bigger briefing room." The name Monarch eventually gave her, after 3 days of careful, patient observation, after Bernie's cross-referencing turned up nothing conclusive enough to justify calling her anything but new, was simply a working designation, clinical and temporary, anomalous entity too. It was Saitama, sitting on the sand beside her on the second evening while she slept the deep, twitching sleep of something finally safe enough to rest, who decided she deserved better than a case file number. "Nazuna," he said, apropos of nothing, when Elaine came to check on the overnight watch rotation. "That's what I'm calling her." "Where'd that come from?" He shrugged, the gesture doing a poor job of hiding something quieter underneath it. "Dunno. Felt right." He glanced at the enormous, slumbering shape beside him, wings folded now instead of dragging, breathing slow and even, for the first time since they'd pulled her from the water. "She's not going to answer to a case number. Figured she should have a name before anybody starts arguing about what to do with her." It stuck, mostly because nobody had the heart to argue with him about it, and by the end of the week the entire outpost, Elaine, Josh, Bernie, even the more clipped and formal members of Marchetti's staff who'd been rotated in to help manage the mounting logistics, had quietly started using it instead of the file designation, a small act of humanizing rebellion that Elaine suspected mattered more to the long-term politics of the situation than anyone in the chain of command above her fully appreciated yet. Nazuna's recovery was slow, methodical and, to Genos's evident relief, entirely uneventful in the specific sense that mattered most. No further escalation, no panic from the surrounding villages once evacuation orders were quietly lifted and replaced with careful, controlled observation. No incidents that gave Marchetti's more hawkish colleagues ammunition to argue containment over cooperation. She ate enormous quantities, delivered by increasingly baffled coastal fishing cooperatives, now operating under classified supply contracts they'd been told, vaguely, involved wildlife rehabilitation. She rested. And, increasingly, she watched Saitama with the same steady, deliberate attention she'd fixed on him that first day on the beach, a bond forming between them that nobody, not Bernie with his instruments, not Genos with his careful cataloging of behavioral data, could fully explain, except to note that it existed, undeniably, and that it seemed to run in both directions. "She trusts you," Elaine said, on the 5th evening, watching from a respectful distance as Saitama sat cross-legged in the sand near Nazuna's enormous folded wing, apparently in the middle of a one-sided conversation about, as far as Elaine could tell from context, the relative merits of instant ramen brands. "I don't fully understand why, but she does." "He has a habit of that," Genos said, joining her at the rail overlooking the makeshift enclosure. More a stretch of restricted beach than any real containment, a distinction Elaine had fought hard to maintain against considerable pressure. "In our world there are very few creatures, very few people, who don't eventually trust him. He never asks anything of them. I think that's rarer than it should be. Elaine considered that, watching Saitama gesture animatedly at something only he found interesting, while Nazuna's great antennae twitched in what might, genuinely, have been amusement. It's not just that he doesn't ask anything, she said slowly, working out something that had been forming in her over the course of the week. It's that he doesn't perform anything either. Every other actor in this situation, Marchetti, Apex, even Monarch at its most careful, is managing an angle. He isn't. He just does the thing that seems right to him and doesn't particularly care how it reads to anyone watching. She glanced at Genos. That's rare in my world too, for what it's worth. Rarer than people like to admit. Genos was quiet for a moment, processing that, and when he spoke again there was something unusually open in his voice. A crack in the rigid formality he otherwise carried like armor. Dr. Andrews, may I ask you something, off the record so to speak? Go ahead. In our world, Sensei's strength cost him something he doesn't talk about, though I've pieced together enough of it over the years to understand the shape of it. He trained until he lost the ability to feel challenged by anything, and somewhere in that process, he also lost most of what used to make him excited, afraid, uncertain, the full range of it. He gained a strength nothing in existence can match, and what he paid for it, I think, was most of the texture of being alive. He looked out at the beach, at Saitama laughing, actually laughing, a real, unguarded sound Elaine hadn't heard from him yet, at something Nazuna had apparently just done with one wing that startled a nearby gull into flight. I haven't heard him laugh like that in longer than I can calculate precisely. I wanted to ask you, do you think this world might give him something his own never could? Elaine watched the scene on the beach for a long moment before answering, weighing the question with the seriousness it deserved. I don't know, she said finally. I know Godzilla didn't manage it. He backed off before your teacher got the fight he was hoping for. I know Apex would take that laugh away from him in a heartbeat if they thought it was profitable to. She paused. But I also know he pulled a drowning stranger out of the ocean 4 days after falling into a world he didn't choose, without being asked, without expecting anything back. And something about doing that seems to have reached him in a way that punching an apex predator never could. She looked at Genos. Maybe strength was never the thing he actually needed tested. Maybe it's this. Down on the beach, as if summoned by the conversation happening about him, Saitama glanced back toward the rail, caught Elaine's eye, and, for just a moment, brief and unguarded and entirely real, grinned. It didn't last. Elaine knew, with the particular clarity she'd built over a decade of watching threats rise and fall along this coastline, that it couldn't last, that somewhere beyond the calm of this one recovering week, Apex was still circling, still patient, still convinced that a man who could erase Godzilla's strongest attack was worth any price to acquire. That the rift that had brought Saitama, Genos, and now Nazuna into this world had torn wide enough, according to Bernie's unresolved anomaly readings, that more might still be coming through, unpredictable and unclaimed, into a world already straining to absorb the first three. And that somewhere in the deep, cold trench off the coast, an ancient, ember-eyed creature that had backed away from a fight for the first time in living memory was, in its own vast and patient way, still turning the encounter over, still waiting, still deciding what it meant. But for one evening, on one quiet stretch of restricted beach, none of that had arrived yet. There was just a man who'd finally found something worth more than winning, a creature who'd finally found somewhere safe to land, and a world slowly, uneasily, beginning to understand that the ground beneath its old certainties had shifted for good. Get some rest, Genos, Elaine said, turning from the rail. Tomorrow's going to be complicated again. Today can just be this. The quiet lasted 11 days, which was, by the standards of everything that had come before, its own small miracle. Long enough for Nazuna's strength to return in full. Long enough for the outpost's rhythm to settle into something that almost resembled normal. Long enough for Elaine to start believing, cautiously, that maybe the worst of the immediate crisis had actually passed. It ended on a gray Tuesday morning with a knock on the annex door that Genos answered before Elaine could reach it, and found, standing on the threshold with an expression of carefully rehearsed warmth, a woman Elaine recognized instantly from a decade-old dossier she'd hoped never to need again. Maya Simmons, Elaine said, arriving at Genos's shoulder with her stomach already sinking. You're a long way from Apex's usual channels. Dr. Andrews. Maya's smile was immaculate, unbothered by the visible tension radiating off both Genos and the two Monarch security personnel who'd fallen in behind Elaine at the sound of the name. I'm not here through channels. I'm here because I think it's time somebody had an honest conversation with your guests instead of a diplomatic one. That's not how this works. You don't get direct access. I'm not asking for access, Maya said smoothly, holding up both hands, empty, in a gesture Elaine recognized as calculated rather than conciliatory. I'm asking for 5 minutes, in front of you, in front of your security, in front of anyone you'd like. If Saitama tells me to leave after that, I'll leave, and Apex won't trouble Monarch about this again. A pause, precisely timed. I think you'll find that's a more generous offer than you're expecting from us. Behind Eileen, Saitama had appeared in the annex doorway, coffee mug in hand, watching the exchange with the same flat, assessing attention he brought to most new variables in his life these days. Let her talk, he said, before Eileen could object further. 5 minutes isn't gonna kill anybody. Elaine wanted to argue. Every instinct built over a decade of watching Apex operate told her that 5 minutes with Maya Simmons was never actually 5 minutes. That the woman built entire strategies around the specific psychology of exactly this kind of small, seemingly reasonable concession. But she'd promised Saitama, on that first difficult day, that his choices would be his own, and she found she couldn't take that back now just because the choice made her nervous. 5 minutes, she said. I'm staying in the room. Wouldn't dream of asking otherwise, Maya said, and stepped inside. She didn't waste the time on pleasantries. She sat across from Saitama at the annex's small kitchen table, folded her hands and got, with the efficiency Walter had built his entire company's culture around, directly to the point. I'm not going to insult you by pretending Apex doesn't want something from you, she said. We do. We've watched the footage from that beach more times than I'd like to admit, and my father believes, I believe, that what you demonstrated that morning represents the single most significant development in Titan-adjacent defense capability in this company's history. I could dress that up in softer language. I won't. You'd see through it, and frankly, I respect you enough not to try. Okay, Saitama said. So what? So here's my actual pitch, and it's simple. Maya leaned forward slightly. Monarch offered you shelter and a doctrine built on caution. Study slowly, protect carefully, keep you comfortable while a dozen committees debate what you mean for 70 years of strategic assumptions. That's not wrong. Exactly. It's also not fast, and it's not built for a world that might need real answers sooner than Monarch's bureaucracy can produce them. She let that sit for a beat. Apex operates differently. We move fast. We fund research that actually gets applied instead of filed. And unlike Monarch, we're prepared to offer you something they can't, which is a way home, Maya said, and Elaine felt the entire room's temperature drop several degrees. Our research division has been studying dimensional rupture signatures since the Hollow Earth discoveries. We don't have a working theory yet for reversing what brought you here. I won't pretend otherwise. But we have resources Monarch doesn't. funding, technology, a willingness to prioritize projects Monarch would spend a decade debating the ethics of before ever actually starting. If there's a path back to your world, Apex is far more likely to find it than a government-adjacent research organization operating under 17 layers of oversight. The silence that followed was total. Elaine watched Saitama's face carefully, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something genuinely difficult cross it. Not the flat boredom, not the quiet resolve she'd come to associate with him, but something rawer, something that looked almost like longing before he caught it and folded it back down. Genos, standing rigid near the wall, had gone very still. "You'd help us go home," Saitama said slowly. "In exchange for what?" "Cooperation," Maya said simply. "Research access. The chance to understand what makes you what you are, under controlled, respectful conditions. Not the horror story monarchs no doubt painted us as. You'd retain full autonomy. You'd never be asked to do anything against your will, but you'd let us study you, properly, with the full resources this company can bring to bear, in exchange for our best effort at getting you and your friend back to the world you actually belong in." She glanced, deliberately, toward the annex window, toward the distant stretch of restricted beach where Nizuna's massive shape was visible even from here. "And we'd extend the same offer to her, if it turns out she has a world to go back to as well." It was, Elaine thought with a cold, sinking clarity, a genuinely brilliant offer, not because it was honest, though parts of it might even have been true, but because it targeted the one thing Monarch, for all its careful ethics, genuinely could not promise: a way home. Every kindness Elaine had shown, every fight she'd won on Saitama's behalf, every quiet evening on the beach, none of it changed the fact that he was, fundamentally, still stranded, still a man who'd walked out for cabbage and never made it back to whatever life he'd left behind. "I need to think about it," Saitama said finally, quiet, and Elaine heard, in the words, something she hadn't expected to hear from him: real uncertainty. "Take your time," Maya said, rising smoothly, gathering herself with the composed satisfaction of someone who'd said exactly what she came to say, and knew, better than anyone in the room, precisely how much weight it would carry once she was gone. "I'll leave contact information with Dr. Andrews. No pressure, no deadline." A pause at the door, her eyes flicking once, briefly, toward Elaine. "Though I'd gently point out, every day that passes is a day Monarch hasn't offered you the same thing. Ask yourself why." She left. The door closed. And in the silence that followed, Elaine watched Saitama stare down at his cooling coffee with an expression she'd never seen on him before, and understood, with a sinking, guilty certainty, that whatever fragile trust she'd built over 11 quiet days had just been tested by something far more dangerous than any weapon Apex could have brought through that door. "Hope." "She's lying," Genos said, the moment the annex door clicked shut, his voice tight with something between anger and fear. "Or if not lying outright, she is offering a promise she cannot actually guarantee. No research team, however well-funded, has any confirmed method for reversing a dimensional rupture. We don't even understand the mechanics of ourselves." "Maybe," Saitama said, still staring at the coffee. "Maybe not. Doesn't really matter if it's guaranteed. Matters if it's possible." He looked up, and the flatness in his eyes had cracked open into something Elaine had genuinely never expected to see from him. A longing so plain and unguarded it made her chest ache. "You ever think about it? Actually going home?" Genos's optical sensors dimmed, just slightly. "Every day," he admitted quietly. "I think about Dr. Kuseno. I think about the city. I think about whether the associations even noticed we're missing, or if they've simply filed us as another disappearance and moved on." He paused. "But I don't trust that woman, Sensei. I don't trust an offer built on the one thing she knows we can't refuse to at least consider. Elaine, who had stayed silent through the exchange out of a discipline that cost her more than she let show, finally spoke, choosing her words with the particular care of someone who knew the ground beneath this conversation had just become dangerously unstable. I won't pretend I'm not scared of losing this argument, she said honestly. But I also won't lie to you the way she just did, dressed up as honesty. Monarch hasn't offered you a way home because we don't have one. We don't have the resources. We don't have the research base. And until 11 days ago, we didn't even know your kind of rupture was survivable, let alone reversible. She met his eyes. That's not me choosing not to help you. That's me telling you the truth about what I can actually deliver, instead of promising something I can't, the way she just did. I know, Saitama said quietly. I know she's playing an angle. I'm not stupid. He set the coffee mug down, hands not quite steady. But knowing it's an angle doesn't make the thing underneath it not true. There might be a way home, and if there is, and I walk away from even a chance at it because I don't like who's holding the door open, that's still my choice to make, and I don't think it's actually crazy to want to think about it. Elaine had no answer for that, because it wasn't wrong, and pretending otherwise would have been its own kind of dishonesty. Take the time she offered, she said finally. Think about it for real, not just today, not just this week. But Saitama, whatever you decide, I need you to understand something. If you go with Apex, even on your own terms, even with every safeguard you can negotiate, you will not be the one holding the leverage in that relationship for very long. Companies like that don't extend generosity as a permanent state. They extend it exactly as long as it costs them nothing. She held his gaze, steady, unflinching. I'm not telling you that to manipulate you into staying. I'm telling you because it's true, and because I think, underneath everything, you already know it too. Saitama didn't answer right away. He looked, instead, out the annex window, toward the beach where Nazuna lay resting in the gray morning light, toward a world that had, in 11 strange days, become something almost like a place he belonged, even stranded, even far from home. And Elaine watched him wrestle, for the first time since she'd met him, with a version of himself that wanted something badly enough that boredom, for once, had nothing to say about it. I'll think about it, he said finally, quiet and honest and, for the first time in 11 days, genuinely uncertain. Just give me some time. Take all the time you need, Elaine said, and meant it, even as some cold, practical part of her mind was already calculating exactly how little time Apex actually intended to give him. The uncertainty didn't resolve itself quietly. It festered, over the following days, in ways that reshaped the whole texture of the outpost. Saitama quieter than before, spending long stretches sitting beside Nazuna without speaking, Genos more watchful than ever, and Elaine caught in the exhausting position of fighting a battle she couldn't openly acknowledge was happening, because acknowledging it meant admitting how close she'd come to losing him without Apex ever laying a hand on anyone. It was Bernie who broke the tension, 4 days after Maya's visit, bursting into the annex common room with the particular urgency that meant something had gone wrong faster than anyone had budgeted for. "We've got a problem," he said, tablet already open, sliding it across the table toward Elaine. Bigger than the last one, deep water sensor array off the Ryukyu chain just picked up movement, and I mean movement, coordinated, multiple contacts, which is not how Titans typically travel unless something's actively hurting them. Elaine scanned the readout, feeling the floor of the morning shift under her. Multiple contacts. How many? 3 confirmed, maybe a 4th we're still resolving. And here's the part that's going to ruin everyone's week. The signature pattern doesn't match anything organic. There's a mechanical resonance underneath it. Consistent, rhythmic, servo-driven. Bernie's face had gone gray. "Eileen, I think somebody's using captured or synthesized Titan biology to build something that moves like a herding unit. And I think I know exactly which companies had the funding and the motive to attempt that particular horror show again. Apex, Eileen said, cold certainty settling into her voice. I can't prove it yet. But it fits the profile too well to ignore, and it fits the timeline too well to be coincidence. 4 days after Maya Simmons walks in here with an offer Saitama hasn't answered yet, something built out of Titan parts starts herding wild Titans toward the Japanese coastline. Bernie looked up, grim. That's not subtle. That's a demonstration. Genos, who had been standing silent near the window through the whole exchange, spoke with the flat, dangerous certainty Elaine had learned meant he'd already run every relevant calculation twice. She is showing him what happens if he refuses, he said. Not directly, not in a way that could ever be traced back cleanly. But the message is unmistakable. Cooperate willingly, or watch a threat of this scale become a permanent feature of the coastline you've chosen to protect. Elaine closed her eyes briefly, feeling the particular exhaustion of watching a manipulation land exactly as intended, in real time, with no clean way to stop it. Get Marchetti, she said. Get satellite confirmation on those contacts. Get everything Bernie's got onto his desk in the next 10 minutes. And get me a channel to whoever's currently running point on the Kyushu defense grid. If this is what it looks like, we don't have days to figure out our response. We might not have hours. The 3 contacts resolved, over the following 2 hours, into a shape that made even Marchetti's carefully cultivated calm falter when the imagery finally came through clean. Not natural Titans at all, but something assembled, chitinous, segmented forms bristling with visible servo joints at every major articulation point, moving in disciplined lockstep through the deep channel south of Kyushu, with a coordination no wild creature, however intelligent, had ever demonstrated in Monarch's recorded history. They're not alive, Elaine said, staring at the feed in the newly convened command room, voice tight. Not fully. Look at the movement pattern. That's not muscle and instinct. That's actuated. Somebody built these. Built them out of what, though? Josh asked, leaning in close enough to the screen that Bernie had to physically pull him back. Because those don't look like pure synthetic constructs. There's organic material woven through the plating. I can see it in the thermal. Harvested, Genos said, quiet and flat, and the whole room turned to look at him. In our world, technology of this kind exists. Grafted biology, forced hybridization, creatures assembled from parts that were never meant to share a single body. It is rarely done for any purpose that could be called kind. His jaw tightened, the closest thing to genuine anger Elaine had seen from him. If your apex has done this to actual Titan remains, living or dead, then whatever they promised Sensei about respectful research conditions was a lie before the sentence finished leaving her mouth. Marchetti, at the head of the table, rubbed a hand across his face, the weight of the morning settling visibly onto his shoulders. I need options, not outrage. If this is heading toward the coast, I need a containment plan that doesn't require me to explain to 11 separate governments why 3 semi-mechanical Titan hybrids made landfall in a fishing prefecture. There's one option that actually works at this notice, Bernie said reluctantly, glancing sideways at Elaine in a way that told her he already knew how badly she'd hate saying it out loud. And everybody in this room already knows what it is. Elaine did know. She'd known since the readout first crossed her screen, and she hated it, and she said it anyway, because the alternative was worse. Saitama, she said. We ask him. We can't keep doing that, Marchetti said, though there was little real conviction in the objection, more the reflexive discomfort of a man who understood, even as he said it, that he was arguing against the only functional solution currently on the table. Every time something this scale surfaces, we default to the one person capable of ending it with a single hit. That's not a defense doctrine. That's dependency. I agree with you completely, Elaine said. And I still think we ask him, because the alternative is letting 3 Titan hybrids reach a populated coastline while we debate doctrine in a conference room. She stood. But General, I want it on record that this conversation isn't over. Whatever happens today, Monarch cannot keep building its entire regional defense posture around one man's willingness to keep saying yes. That's not sustainable, and it's not fair to him, and eventually it's going to break something, either in him or in us. Marchetti held her gaze for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. Nodded, he said. Go ask him. She found Saitama exactly where she expected, sitting on the sand beside Nazuna, who had lifted her great head at Elaine's approach with the alert, protective attention she'd developed over the past 2 weeks, whenever anyone rushed toward Saitama with bad news written across their face. I know that look, Saitama said, before Elaine even reached him. What is it this time? She told him everything. The 3 hybrid contacts, the mechanical signature woven through organic material. Bernie's near certain read that Apex sat somewhere behind it, and the specific ugly timing that made the whole thing feel less like coincidence and more like a message. She watched his face change as she spoke, the quiet uncertainty of the past 4 days hardening into something colder and more focused. So she's saying yes, or watch this happen again, Saitama said when Elaine finished. Every time I don't answer fast enough. That's my read. I can't prove it in a courtroom, but I've seen enough of how Apex operates to trust my gut on this one. Genos, who had followed her down to the beach, spoke with quiet, contained fury. This is precisely what I feared, Sensei. She is not offering you a choice. She is manufacturing a crisis specifically shaped to make refusal feel unconscionable. Saitama was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the gray water, jaw tight in a way Elaine hadn't seen from him before. Not the flat boredom, not the raw longing from 4 days ago, but something harder, something that looked, for the first time since she'd met him, genuinely close to anger. You know what the worst part is, he said finally. It's gonna work, not because I'm scared of her, because if I say no and people get hurt because of something she built specifically to make that point, that's on me too, whether I like it or not. He stood, brushing sand off his jumpsuit with 2 brisk, angry pats. I'll handle it. The hybrids, today. Not because she's forcing my hand on the other thing. I still haven't decided that, and I'm not gonna let her decide it for me by scaring me into it. He looked at Elaine, something resolute settling into his expression. But people are about to be in danger because of a decision I haven't even made yet, and I'm not gonna let that happen just to prove a point about not being manipulated. Elaine felt a complicated wash of relief and guilt in equal measure. Relief that the immediate threat had an answer. Guilt that the answer required, once again, asking one person to carry a weight that should never have belonged to him alone. I'll get you transport to the intercept point, she said. And Saitama, for what it's worth, I don't think handling this today is the same as saying yes to her offer. I think it's you refusing to let her turn other people's safety into a bargaining chip. Those aren't the same decision, whatever she wants you to believe. Something in his expression eased, fractionally, at that. A small, tired gratitude he didn't quite have words for. Yeah, he said. That's the plan anyway. Beside him, Nazuna let out a low, resonant hum, wings unfolding with sudden purpose, and Genos's sensors flickered with quick understanding. She wants to come, he said. She says, I believe she's saying she wants to help. Saitama looked at her, considering, and something like real warmth broke through the hard set of his jaw for just a moment. Yeah, he said. Okay, let's go show this thing what a bad idea it was to mess with people who don't scare easy. The intercept point lay 40 kilometers off the Ryukyu chain's northernmost island, Open water gone the color of gunmetal under a sky thick with the kind of low, bruised cloud that seemed, to Elaine, to arrive precisely when the situation called for it, as if the weather itself had learned, over years of Titan encounters, to dress appropriately for catastrophe. She watched from the deck of a Monarch surveillance vessel, holding station at a distance the tactical team had insisted on, and Saitama had visibly found unnecessary, as Nazuna's massive silhouette cut low across the water ahead of them, wings beating with a strength that bore no resemblance to the exhausted, drowning creature they'd pulled from the surf 2 weeks earlier. Saitama rode astride her back near the base of her neck, one hand resting lightly against her scales, looking for all the world like a man out for an unhurried commute, rather than a passenger about to confront 3 weaponized Titan hybrids assembled from harvested biology. "Contact in 90 seconds, the vessel's tactical officer called out, eyes on the radar display. They're holding formation, still heading toward the channel. No deviation despite our approach. They're not reacting to us at all," Bernie said, hunched over his own monitor, brow furrowed. "That's not natural behavior. That's programmed. Whoever's running point on this thing built them to ignore anything short of direct engagement." Genos, standing rigid at the rail beside Elaine, had gone very quiet, sensors locked on the horizon where the first hint of movement had begun to break the swell. "They will not stop for negotiation," he said. "Sensei understands that. He does not typically attempt negotiation with constructs incapable of choosing otherwise." The first hybrid breached less than a kilometer ahead of Nazuna's approach, and Elaine's breath caught, despite every briefing photo she'd already studied. It was worse in motion, the segmented, chitinous plating catching the gray light in a way that looked wrong, organic tissue visibly straining against mechanical joints that had been forced into a body never designed to hold them. Servo whirs audible even across the water, underlaid by something that might, disturbingly, have once been a roar and was now closer to a grinding shriek. "Dear God," the tactical officer breathed. "That thing's in pain." "They built it in pain," Genos said, low and furious. "It has likely never known anything else." Saitama's expression, visible even at this distance through Elaine's binoculars, had gone flat and hard in a way she recognized now. Not the boredom of a man facing no real challenge, but the specific, focused stillness of someone who had already decided exactly how much mercy this fight would get, and was bracing to deliver it precisely. He slid off Nazuna's back mid-air, dropping the last 20 meters toward the water's surface with the same unhurried calm he'd shown falling off the cliff 2 weeks earlier, and landed, not in the water, but on it, boots finding purchase against the swell, as though gravity itself had quietly agreed to make an exception. "Sensei's walking on water," Josh said, somewhere behind Elaine, in the tone of a man whose capacity for surprise had finally, permanently broken. The first hybrid turned toward him, slow, mechanical, its assembled biology straining audibly against the forced movement, and opened a maw ringed with plating that had clearly once belonged to something else entirely, something that had never asked to become part of this. Elaine watched Saitama's expression shift again, and for a moment, before the strike landed, she thought she saw something that looked almost like grief. "I'm sorry," he said, quiet enough that only the surveillance vessel's directional mics caught it clean, "that this is what they made you into." The punch, when it came, was almost gentle by the standard of what she'd watched him do to Godzilla's atomic breath 2 weeks prior. Not an erasure, not a redirection, but something more precise, more deliberate. A single strike aimed with surgical care at the seam where mechanical grafting met organic tissue. The hybrid didn't explode, didn't vaporize the way Eileen's braced for impact instincts had expected. It simply stopped, the servo whir cutting out, the strained, grinding shriek falling silent. the whole assembled horror of it sinking gently beneath the surface, dismantled rather than destroyed. He didn't kill it, Genos said, quiet wonder threading through his usual flat certainty. He ended its suffering without ending its life. I've watched him make that distinction 100 times, and it never stops meaning something. The second and third hybrids came at him together, faster, more coordinated, whatever remained of their programming apparently registering the loss of the first as a threat requiring immediate escalation. And Saitama met them both without hesitation, movements economical and precise, each strike aimed with the same careful, surgical restraint, until within the space of perhaps 90 seconds the water had gone still again, 3 broken, silent constructs settling slowly into the deep, and Nazuna circling low overhead in a wide, watchful arc. Her earlier urgency dissolved into something that looked, even from the vessel's deck, remarkably like relief. Saitama stood alone on the water's surface for a long moment afterward, shoulders lowered, some private weight visibly settling onto him that had nothing to do with physical exertion. "Bring him aboard," Elaine said quietly, and the vessel began, slowly, to close the distance. He didn't speak on the ride back to the outpost, not really. A few short words to Genos, a hand resting absently against Nazuna's neck when she landed beside the boat to check on him, but nothing that resembled the flat, mild conversational rhythm Elaine had grown used to over 2 weeks. It was only once they were back on solid ground, standing alone on the annex porch while the rest of the team debriefed inside, that he finally spoke what had clearly been sitting in him since the first punch landed. "Those things were alive once," he said. "Whatever they got welded onto, however they got twisted into that shape, somewhere under all that plating, there was something that used to just be a creature, minding its own business, before somebody decided it was worth more as a weapon." He looked at Elaine, and the anger she'd seen on the beach that morning had cooled into something heavier, more settled. "That's the real answer to her offer. I don't need to think about it anymore. Saitama, I'm not saying it because I'm scared of what she'd do to me," he said. "I already figured that part out on my own. I've dealt with people who want to use strength for the wrong reasons before, back home. It's not new, it's just usually smaller scale." He looked out toward the water, toward the horizon where 3 broken hybrids had gone quietly under. "I'm saying it because I saw what respectful research conditions actually looks like when a company like that gets its hands on something strong and decides it's worth taking apart to understand. I'm not walking into that. Not for a chance at home. Not for anything." He turned back to her. Something resolute and unshakable settled into his flat, tired eyes. "I made my choice. I'm staying here, working with you, doing this the way we've been doing it. Not because Monarch's perfect, but because at least you ask before you take." Elaine felt something in her chest loosen that had been wound tight since the moment Maya Simmons first walked through the annex door, and beneath the relief, something else. A quiet, growing certainty that whatever fight was still coming, whatever Apex's next move looked like once this offer was formally, finally refused, they were going to face it with someone standing beside them who had chosen it freely, with clear eyes, having seen exactly what the alternative cost. "Thank you for telling me," she said simply. "Don't thank me yet," Saitama said, and something almost like his old dry humor crept back into his voice, tired but real. "She's not gonna take that well. You said it yourself. Companies like that don't stay generous once you stop being useful to their plan." He glanced toward the horizon one more time, toward the deep water where a broken piece of Apex's ambition had just sunk quietly out of sight. "Guess we'll find out what she does next." Walter Simmons received the report on the 3 destroyed hybrids with the same composed stillness he brought to every setback, though Maya, watching him read it in his office that evening, recognized the particular quality of his silence as something closer to genuine anger than she'd seen from her father in years. He dismantled 3 years of R&D in under 2 minutes, she said, when he finally set the tablet down. Cleanly, almost, I'd call it merciful, if the word applied to anything we do here. It applies to nothing we do here, Walter said, without inflection. And that was always the point of the exercise, wasn't it? Not the hybrids themselves, what his reaction to them would tell us. He rose, crossing to the window overlooking the tower's lower research levels, hands folded behind his back in the posture Maya had learned. Over 30 years, meant a decision was already made, and the conversation happening now was simply the formality of announcing it. He refused the offer before I ever received formal word of it. I could tell from the report. A man doesn't dismantle a company's asset with that kind of care, unless he's already decided exactly where he stands. So we escalate. We reconsider our approach, Walter corrected, mild as ever, though something colder had crept into the calm. Diplomacy assumed he valued discretion the way Monarch does. He doesn't. He has no career to protect, no classified clearance to lose, no institutional loyalty binding his choices. Every lever that normally works on people in his position simply isn't there. He turned back from the window. But there is one lever that still applies, Maya, and it's the one Monarch's entire doctrine depends on us never pulling. Maya understood immediately, and something in her sharpened at the elegance of it even as a smaller, quieter part of her recognized exactly how far past careful they were about to move. The public, she said. Monarch has kept the existence of Titans partially classified for 70 years under the doctrine that panic causes more harm than the creatures themselves, Walter said. That doctrine has never been tested against something like this. A man who publicly, visibly, on camera, ended an atomic breath attack with his bare hands. Right now, that footage exists only within 3 classified systems, and whatever Apex quietly retains. The moment it becomes public, Monarch's entire secrecy framework collapses, because there is no version of Contain the Narrative that survives footage this extraordinary reaching open media. He allowed himself something almost like a smile. And once the world knows what he is, once every government on the planet is fielding the same question my daughter and I have been asking privately for 2 weeks, Monarch will find itself with considerably less room to keep protecting him quietly, and considerably more pressure to hand him over to whichever organization can promise the public actual answers, instead of careful, classified silence. Maya studied her father for a long moment, weighing the calculation against the cost. This will not stay clean, she said. The moment the footage leaks, every intelligence service on Earth starts asking who filmed it, who had access, who benefits. Will be exposed inside a week. Then we make certain the leak is untraceable to us specifically, and we make certain that by the time anyone thinks to ask, the public conversation has already moved past who released it and onto what it means. Walter's voice remained perfectly level, perfectly reasonable, the voice of a man who had made peace, long ago, with exactly how much collateral damage his ambitions required. Prepare the release. Route it through 3 cutouts, minimum. And Maya, make sure it reaches outlets that will run with the spectacle first, and the sourcing questions second. We don't need it to be believed immediately. We just need it seen. It reached the public 41 hours later, in the worst possible way. Not through a single controlled leak, but a cascading, uncontrollable spill. The drone footage from Otsuchihama Bay surfacing simultaneously on 3 continents worth of social platforms within the same 6-hour window. Stripped of context, stamped with timestamps that made its authenticity nearly impossible to credibly deny, and accompanied, within hours, by grainy secondary footage of the beach itself, of Saitama, of a bay full of fleeing fishing boats, that any coastal resident of Kyushu could confirm had genuinely happened. Elaine learned about it the way most of Monarch's senior staff did. A 4 a.m. call from Marchetti's office, terse and grim, instructing her to report to the command center immediately. No explanation offered because none was needed once she opened her phone and saw, already trending across every platform she checked, a video with over 11 million views, and a caption that read, simply, "This is real. Godzilla just got beaten by one punch. It's everywhere," Josh said when she arrived, pale and hollow-eyed in a way that suggested he hadn't slept at all. "I mean everywhere, Elaine. News networks in 9 countries have already run segments. There's a hashtag. And it's not even the worst part." He turned his laptop toward her, showing a live news broadcast, a panel of visibly rattled analysts debating the footage's authenticity with the specific, escalating urgency of people who'd already privately concluded it was real and hadn't figured out yet how to say so on air. "The worst part is Command's fielding calls from 4 different governments in the last 90 minutes, all asking the same question in slightly different diplomatic language. What is Monarch hiding? And why haven't we been told about it?" Marchetti's office, when Elaine reached it, looked like a man's career quietly imploding in real time. 3 phones, 2 aides, and a general whose carefully cultivated calm had, for the first time since she'd known him, visibly cracked. 70 years, he said, when she stepped in, not bothering with preamble. 70 years of doctrine built around the idea that the public can't be trusted with the full truth of what's out there, and it took 11 million views in one night to unravel it. He rubbed his eyes. "I've got the Secretary of Defense's office on hold. I've got a UN liaison who wants a formal briefing by end of week. I've got 2 governments quietly threatening to go public with their own classified Titan files if Monarch doesn't get ahead of this narrative fast, because apparently nobody wants to be the last agency still pretending secrecy is viable." He looked at her, something almost pleading in the exhaustion behind his eyes. "Tell me you have a plan, because I don't, and I've been staring at this problem since 3 in the morning." Elaine thought of Saitama, asleep, or trying to be, in the annex a few hundred meters away, entirely unaware that the world had, in the space of a single night, decided what he was for him, loudly, publicly, irreversibly. "The plan," she said slowly, working it out as she spoke, "is that we don't get ahead of the narrative. We stop trying to control it, and we tell the truth instead, carefully, on our terms, before somebody else's version of the truth, Apex's version, and I'd bet real money this leak traces back to them, becomes the only story anyone hears." She met Marchetti's eyes. "The doctrine of secrecy died last night, General, not because we chose to end it, because somebody made that choice for us. The only thing left to decide is whether Monarch controls what comes next, or whether we let Apex's timeline and Apex's framing win by default because we were too slow to adapt." Marchetti was quiet for a long moment, and Elaine watched him weigh 70 years of institutional instinct against the plain, unavoidable math of the situation in front of him. "You're proposing we go public," he said, "officially, on the record. I'm proposing we tell the truth about a man who saved a fishing village and dismantled a set of illegal Titan hybrid weapons before he ever hurt anyone," Elaine said, "because that's what actually happened, and it's a far better story than whatever Apex is currently trying to spin, and because Saitama deserves to have his own choices represented honestly, instead of buried under classified silence that only ever protected institutions, never people." She found him on the beach before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, sitting beside Nazuna in the pale gray light, and understood from the set of his shoulders that he already knew, somehow, that something had shifted overnight. "Genos woke me up an hour ago," he said before she could speak. "Showed me the footage, the views, all of it." He didn't look at her, staring instead at the water, at the horizon where the sky had begun, faintly, to lighten. "Guess that's it, huh? No more quiet. No more quiet, Eileen confirmed, sitting down heavily beside him. I'm sorry. This isn't how I wanted this to happen. I wanted you to have a say in when and how the world found out, not to have it stolen from you in the middle of the night by a leak I'm 90% certain traces back to Apex. Doesn't surprise me, he said, quiet, tired. She said it herself, didn't she? Every lever that works on other people doesn't work the same on me. Guess she found a different one. He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, there was something steadier in his voice than Elaine expected, something that suggested he'd already, in the hour since waking, worked through the worst of the shock and arrived somewhere calmer on the other side. So what happens now? Everybody knows. Every government, every company, every random person with a phone. What's Monarch gonna do about that? Marchetti's putting together an official statement, Elaine said. The truth, what actually happened at Otsuchihama, what you did with the hybrids, all of it, on the record, in our own words instead of letting the leak define the story. But Saitama, she hesitated, I won't pretend this doesn't change things. Once the world knows what you're capable of, every actor with an agenda is going to want something from you. Openly this time, not just Apex, governments, militaries, people who will frame it as public safety, or global defense necessity, or 100 other justifications for wanting a piece of you. Yeah, Saitama said, figured that part out on my own too. He finally looked at her, and something in his flat, tired eyes had hardened into a resolve she hadn't seen from him before. Not the quiet stubbornness of the cabbage argument, not the raw uncertainty of Maya's offer, but something that looked for the first time genuinely like a man choosing his own terms in a fight he hadn't asked for. So we tell them straight, not what I can do for them, what I'm actually willing to do, and what I'm not. He stood, brushing sand from his jumpsuit, and for a moment, the old dry flatness crept back into his voice, worn thin, but unmistakably still there. I didn't come here to be anybody's weapon. Didn't come here to be a secret either. I guess, not anymore. Might as well figure out what I actually want to be, now that the whole world's watching to find out. Nazuna beside him let out a low, resonant hum, and Genos, arriving down the beach at a jog, fell into step beside them both with the quiet, steady loyalty that had carried him through every strange turn since the rift first tore open over a Z-City crosswalk. Whatever you decide, Elaine said, standing beside him. I'll help you say it the right way. Not Marchetti's way, not the doctrine's way. Yours. Saitama looked out at the brightening water, at a world that had, overnight, stopped being able to pretend it didn't know what he was, and something in his exhausted, resolute expression settled, finally, into something like readiness. Yeah, he said. Let's go figure out what that even sounds like. The press conference convened 3 days later in a hastily repurposed briefing hall at Monarch's regional headquarters, cameras from 41 countries crammed into a room built for a fraction of that number, and Eileen stood just off the podium's edge, watching Marchetti take his place behind a bank of microphones, with the particular stiffness of a man delivering news he still hadn't fully made peace with delivering. 70 years ago, Marchetti began, voice carrying the practiced steadiness of a career officer who'd learned long before this moment how to sound calm, regardless of what was happening underneath. Monarch was founded on a doctrine that has, in various forms, guided every decision this organization has made since. That the world's population could not be trusted with the full truth of what shares this planet with us, and that secrecy, however imperfect, served the greater good better than panic would. He paused, and Elaine watched something shift in his posture, a decision finally settling. That doctrine failed us 3 nights ago, when footage of an extraordinary event reached the public without our consent and without our context. I'm here today because I believe that failure, however it happened, deserves an honest reckoning rather than another layer of managed silence. He laid it out plainly after that. The rift, its arrivals, the confrontation at Otsuchihama, the dismantled hybrid constructs that Monarch's own forensics team had, in the intervening days, confirmed carried unmistakable traces of Apex patented biological grafting technology. The room erupted at that detail in particular, a scatter of urgent, competing questions that Marchetti fielded with visibly fraying patience, until a hand went up from the second row that Elaine recognized, a correspondent from a major wire service, sharp-eyed and unhurried in a room full of shouting. "General, you're alleging a private defense contractor manufactured weaponized Titan hybrids and deployed them near a populated coastline. That's a serious accusation. Do you have evidence beyond circumstantial forensic overlap?" "We have evidence sufficient to have referred the matter to the appropriate international oversight bodies," Marchetti said carefully. "I won't try this case from a podium. I will say that the timing, the technology signature, and the target were not, in Monarch's assessment, coincidental." The questions kept coming, sharper now, circling toward the thing every camera in the room had actually come for. "General, the individual in the footage, is he human? Is he a threat? Is he currently in Monarch custody?" Elaine felt the room's attention pivot as one, and beside her, just visible through the gap in the curtain wing, Saitama stood waiting for the cue they'd agreed on, Genos a steady presence at his shoulder, both of them dressed, at Elaine's gentle insistence, in clothes that read as ordinary rather than costumed, a decision that had felt, in the planning, like a small thing, and now, watching the room's collective breath catch as Marchetti gestured toward the wing, felt enormous. "He's not in custody," Marchetti said. "He's a guest, and I think it's past time he spoke for himself." Saitama walked out from the wing into a wall of camera flashes with an expression that hadn't changed 1 degree from the flat, unbothered mildness Elaine had first seen in a forest clearing weeks ago, and something about that exact, unhurried calm, a man visibly unmoved by 41 countries' worth of cameras trained on his face, seemed to land on the room harder than any prepared statement could have. "Hi," he said into the microphone, and the simplicity of it, after days of speculation and 11 million views of grainy footage, seemed almost to disarm the room. "My name's Saitama. I'm not from here. I ended up in your world by accident, and I've been trying to figure out, this whole time, what the right thing to do with that is." A dozen hands shot up. He pointed, at random, to a woman near the front who looked almost too startled to have actually volunteered. "Are you dangerous?" she asked, blunt, the question everyone in the room had actually come to hear answered. Saitama considered that with the same unhurried honesty he brought to most things. "I could be, I guess, if I wanted to be. I'm strong enough that I don't really have to worry about getting hurt by most stuff." He paused. "But I'm not going to hurt anybody who isn't trying to hurt somebody else first. That's kind of always been the rule, back home too. I didn't come here to conquer anything. I came here for cabbage, and then the sky ripped open, and I've mostly just been trying to help since." It should have sounded absurd, Elaine thought, watching the room. A room full of hardened correspondents, diplomats' aides, intelligence liaisons, and yet something in the plain, unembellished honesty of it seemed to cut through faster than any polished statement could have. Not everyone in the room believed him instantly. She could see skepticism etched into more than a few faces, the particular professional wariness of people who'd built careers around not taking extraordinary claims at face value. But nobody laughed either, and in a room primed for either panic or mockery, that alone felt like a victory she hadn't expected to win so cleanly. The questions kept coming for nearly an hour, about Nizuna, about Genos, about the hybrids, about what, exactly, Apex had been attempting and why. And Elaine watched Saitama answer each one with the same unhurried, unguarded honesty, never performing, never managing an angle, exactly the quality she'd told Genos, weeks ago, that she thought made him different from every other actor circling this situation. It was near the end, when the room's energy had settled into something closer to genuine engagement than spectacle, that the question came that Elaine had been quietly dreading since the moment they'd decided to go public. A man near the back, credentials identifying him with a defense policy outlet Elaine recognized as reliably hawkish, stood without waiting to be called on. If Monarch's own doctrine says Godzilla is the ceiling this world's defense posture is built around, and you've just told us there's a man who's demonstrably stronger than that ceiling, walking around freely, unaligned with any government, I think a lot of people watching this broadcast are going to want to know why that's not being treated as the single greatest national security concern on the planet. Why should we trust an organization that's already lost control of this story once to manage what happens next? The room went quiet in a different way than before. Not curious now, but tense. The question hanging in the air with the particular weight of something that every government watching this broadcast had almost certainly already been debating in private for 3 days. Marchetti opened his mouth to answer, and Elaine watched Saitama step slightly forward instead, taking the question for himself. "You're not wrong to worry about that," he said, and something in the plain, direct honesty of the admission seemed to catch the room off guard more than any reassurance could have. "If I wanted to hurt people, there's not a lot anybody here could do to stop me. I get why that's scary." He paused, and for a moment, the flat mildness gave way to something more deliberate, more weighted, a man choosing his words with real care. "But here's the thing. Strength like mine doesn't come with an instruction manual for what to do with it. I had to figure that part out myself, a long time before I ever ended up here. And what I figured out is that the only thing that actually matters is what you choose to do when nobody can stop you from doing whatever you want." He looked out at the room, at the cameras, at 41 countries worth of people waiting to hear whether the answer would be reassuring or a threat. "I choose to help, every time. Not because some organization's controlling me, and not because I'm scared of what happens if I don't. Because it's the right thing to do, and because a world where the strongest thing in it does whatever it wants without caring who gets hurt isn't a world I want to be part of, whether it's mine or not. A beat, quiet and unadorned. That's not a policy. That's just who I am. I know that's not the kind of guarantee your governments usually deal in. It's the only one I've got." The silence that followed lasted several seconds, long enough that Elaine felt her own pulse in her throat, uncertain which way the room would break. It was, unexpectedly, the same hawkish correspondent who spoke first, his voice quieter now, some of the challenge drained out of it. "And if that changes, if you decide one day that helping isn't worth it anymore." Saitama's answer, when it came, was simple enough that it took Elaine a moment to register how much weight sat underneath it. "Then I guess you'll all have a real problem," he said. "But I've been doing this a long time, in a world that gave me a lot more reasons to stop caring than this one has so far. I'm still here, still doing it. That's the best answer I've got, and I think it's a fair one." Marchetti stepped back to the podium, visibly recognizing the moment for what it was, as close to a resolution as this particular room was going to reach today, and began winding the conference toward its close. But Elaine, watching from the wing, understood that something had shifted in that exchange that no amount of careful staging could have manufactured. The world hadn't been reassured, exactly, but it had been given something rarer than reassurance. An honest man, telling an uncomfortable truth plainly, in a moment built almost entirely around performance and spin. Whether that would be enough, whether it would hold, against everything still circling beneath the surface, Apex's ambitions and the deep, unresolved wariness of a dozen governments, now forced to reckon publicly with a variable they'd never planned for. Elaine didn't know, but watching Saitama step back from the podium, Genos falling into step beside him with quiet, steady pride, she allowed herself, for the first time since the leak broke 3 nights ago, a small, cautious hope that the world might actually find a way to hold this truth without breaking around it. 2 weeks after the press conference, the world had not stopped watching, but it had, in the particular way large institutions eventually settle into new equilibriums, begun to metabolize the shock into something closer to policy. Committees convened, position papers drafted, 3 separate nations quietly requesting formal liaison access that monarch, newly emboldened by the public's surprisingly steady reaction, had actually begun granting under careful terms. Elaine found herself, more often than not, buried in diplomatic paperwork instead of field reports, a change she was still deciding whether to resent. It was Bernie, again, who broke the fragile calm, not with the frantic urgency of the hybrid discovery, but with something quieter and, in its own way, far more unsettling. "I need you to look at this before I take it to Marchetti," he said, finding Elaine in the annex common room where she'd been reviewing liaison paperwork with Josh, and sliding his tablet across the table with the particular grimness of a man who'd hoped, right up until the last data point confirmed it, that he was wrong. Satellite pass over an Apex-owned facility in the Aleutians 3 days ago. Deep excavation work, heavy shielding, power draw consistent with, Elaine, consistent with a containment rig built to house something Titan scale. Elaine scanned the imagery, her stomach already sinking before Bernie finished the sentence she could see coming. "Tell me it's not what I think it is. I wish I could." Bernie pulled up a second image, older, archived, a schematic Elaine recognized instantly from a briefing she'd sat through years ago, and hoped never to need again. "The power signature matches almost exactly what we recorded during the original Godzilla incident. Different chassis, near as I can tell. Probably rebuilt from scratch given the last one got destroyed. But the core technology, the neural interface architecture, the biological integration systems, that's not new tech. That's the same playbook, refined." He looked up, grim. Apex lost the hybrid gambit, lost the public narrative fight. "I think they've decided the only lever left that could still work is building something big enough that Saitama's cooperation stops being optional." Genos, who had entered partway through the explanation, went very still. "They intend to threaten this world with a weapon capable of matching a Titan," he said slowly, "in order to force Sensei's hand." "That's my read," Bernie said. "And here's the part that's really going to ruin your afternoon. The schematic shows integration points for something beyond standard Titan cell hybridization. There's a secondary power core in the design that doesn't match anything in our existing Godzilla files. Something new." He hesitated. "I've got a partial materials analysis flagged from a leaked supply manifest. It references cellular materials sourced from what the manifest calls, and I'm quoting directly, residual Ghidorah-adjacent biomass." The room went cold. "Ghidorah's dead," Josh said. "Too fast." The particular fast of a man hoping saying it firmly enough would make it more true. "Confirmed dead, years ago. That can't be a live sample." "It doesn't need to be live," Genos said quietly. "In our world's own history, the technology Sensei described, grafted biology, forced integration, does not require a living donor, only usable genetic material. If Apex has recovered even fragmentary Ghidorah-derived tissue and successfully integrated it into a new mechanized chassis, then they're not just building another Godzilla," Elaine finished, the full weight of it settling over her. "They're building something that inherits whatever made Ghidorah dangerous enough to nearly end the world the last time he surfaced. Multiple heads, gravity manipulation, potentially the ability to actually challenge Godzilla directly, instead of just matching him on raw power. And they're doing it, Bernie said, specifically because the one thing on this planet capable of no-selling that kind of firepower has made it very clear he's not for sale. Marchetti's response, when the full briefing reached him an hour later, was immediate and uncharacteristically decisive. A formal demand for international inspection access to the Aleutian facility, routed through every diplomatic channel Monarch's newly public standing had opened up over the past 2 weeks, backed by satellite evidence too specific to credibly stonewall. It bought them, in the end, 3 days before Apex's legal team ran out of delaying maneuvers. It was not enough time. The alert came at 0230, Bernie's voice cracking through the outpost's emergency channel with a rawness that told Elaine, before he'd said a single coherent word, exactly how bad the situation had become. "It's active," he said. "The Aleutian facility, whatever they built, it's live, it's mobile, and it's moving. Fast. Trajectories southbound. And Elaine, the power output on this thing is off every scale we've got calibrated. This isn't a demonstration anymore. This is a weapon they've decided to actually deploy." Elaine was already moving, pulling on her jacket, radio pressed to her ear, adrenaline burning through the last fog of interrupted sleep. Deploy toward what? I don't know yet, but given the timing, given everything we know about what this thing was built to accomplish, Bernie's voice tightened. I think it's headed toward wherever their intelligence says Saitama currently is. I think this is Apex's last real card, and I think they're playing it because they've decided a demonstration of overwhelming force is the only thing left that might actually change his answer. She found Saitama already awake when she reached the annex, standing at the window with an expression that told her he'd heard the alert through the thin walls before she'd even reached the door. Genos beside him with sensors locked on some distant readout only he could parse. Nazuna's low, uneasy hum audible even from the restricted beach beyond. "They built something," he said, before Elaine could speak. "Something big. I can feel it in how everyone's moving." He turned, and the old, worn flatness in his expression had given way to something colder, more focused than she'd seen from him since the hybrids. "This the last card, huh? Guess she wasn't kidding about not taking it well." "We don't have full details yet," Elaine said, "but Bernie's read is that it's carrying integrated material from Saitama, from Ghidorah, a creature Monarch fought and barely survived, years before you arrived. If even a fraction of what made that fight so dangerous carried over into whatever Apex built, then it's gonna hit hard," Saitama finished, unbothered in the specific way that had, over weeks, stopped reading to Elaine as indifference and started reading as something closer to hard-won calm. "Okay, where? We don't know yet. It's moving fast, and Bernie thinks it's tracking you specifically, which means I don't need to go find it," Saitama said. "It's coming to me." He glanced at Genos, some old, wordless understanding passing between them, the same understanding Elaine had watched carry them through every escalation since the beach at Otsuchihama. "Guess we wait then. Not exactly my favorite part." Outside, the first alarms began sounding across the outpost, and far to the north, moving south across dark water with a speed and power signature that made even Monarch's most hardened analysts go quiet with dread. Something built from stolen ambition and borrowed apocalypse cut a widening wake through the sea, carrying toward a confrontation that Eileen understood, with sudden and total clarity, would not end the way any of Apex's careful calculations had promised. The construct made landfall at dawn, not at the outpost, not at any coastline Monarch had braced for, but directly at the restricted beach where Nazuna rested. A choice. Elaine understood instantly. That was no accident at all. Whoever had programmed its targeting parameters had aimed not for Saitama alone, but for everything he'd chosen to protect. A calculated cruelty dressed up as strategy. It came out of the gray pre-dawn water in silence first. No roar, no announcement, just a vast angular silhouette breaking the swell with a stillness that felt worse than any noise could have. 3 serpentine necks unfurling from a chassis of dull gunmetal plating grafted, in places, with tissue that pulsed faintly gold beneath the armor, a wrongness stitched into every joint. Where Godzilla's scale had felt ancient and earned, this thing's scale felt manufactured, aggressive, built specifically to overwhelm, rather than simply to exist. Sensor confirms triple cranial structure, Genos reported, voice tight, standing beside Saitama at the tide line, as the construct's shadow fell long and cold across the sand. Gravitational distortion readings consistent with Ghidorah lineage biomass integration. Sensei, this is not a simple mechanized weapon. It is drawing on capabilities this world has only survived once before, and barely. Yeah, Saitama said, rolling his shoulder. The old habitual gesture that Elaine, watching from the command truck's open door with binoculars raised, and her whole body wound tight, had learned to read now as something closer to focus than boredom. I got that. Behind him, Nazuna had risen to her full height, wings spread wide and defensive, positioning herself between the construct and the low dune, where Elaine's team had hurried the last remaining coastal residents to shelter overnight. Her low, resonant hum had shifted into something sharper, more urgent. Not the song of recognition she'd offered Saitama weeks earlier, but a warning call that Bernie, monitoring frequencies from the truck, flagged as carrying a resonance pattern uncomfortably close to genuine distress. She's scared of it, Elaine said quietly. She should be, Genos said. Whatever remains of Ghidorah in that construct, even fragmentary, even mechanized, creatures like her carry deep, instinctive memory of what that lineage represents. Fear, in her case, is not weakness. It is knowledge. The construct's central head lowered, gunmetal jaw parting to reveal a chamber of pulsing gold light building toward what every instrument on the beach recognized, with sick certainty, as a discharge attack scaled well beyond anything the original hybrids had carried. Get everyone back, Elaine barked into the radio, already knowing, even as she said it, that distance was a courtesy this fight had no real use for. Saitama didn't wait for the beam to fully charge. He crossed the sand in a blur that left a shallow furrow in his wake, closing the distance to the construct's base in less than a second, and drove a single strike upward into the joint where the central neck met the reinforced chassis. A strike aimed. Elaine understood, watching the footage back later in agonizing slow motion, with the same surgical precision he'd shown dismantling the hybrids weeks before. An attempt, even now, even facing something built explicitly to hurt him, to spare whatever remained alive beneath the plating. It didn't work the way it had before. The construct staggered, gunmetal plating buckling under the impact with a shriek of tortured metal. But where the hybrids had simply gone still and sunk beneath the surface, this thing recoiled and struck back, a second head snapping down at Saitama, with speed that outpaced anything either previous confrontation had demonstrated. Jaws closing around empty air as he twisted clear at the last possible instant. The first time since his arrival that Elaine had watched him need to actually dodge something rather than simply absorb or redirect it. It's fast, Genos said, sensors cycling rapidly, something like genuine alarm entering his voice for the first time in weeks. Sensei, its reaction speed is scaling with yours in real time. This is not simple programmed aggression. Something in its design is adapting. Learning system, Bernie confirmed grimly over the radio, watching telemetry spike on his monitors. They built it to calibrate against him specifically. Every hit he lands, every dodge he makes, it's feeding back into the construct's combat model. The longer this fight runs, the better it gets at reading him. Elaine felt ice settle in her stomach. Then we need this over fast. On the beach, the construct's third head swung wide in a strike Elaine realized, a half-second too late, was aimed not at Saitama at all, but at Nazuna, a calculated pivot, the learning system apparently having already identified, within the first 30 seconds of engagement, that Saitama's one demonstrable weakness was not physical vulnerability, but the people and creatures he refused to let get hurt. "Nazuna!" Saitama's voice cracked across the beach, the first time Elaine had heard genuine, unguarded fear in it since she'd known him, and he moved faster than she'd ever seen him move, faster than the footage would even properly resolve on review, closing the gap between himself and the descending jaws with a desperation that had nothing to do with strategy, and everything to do with the same plain, unperformed loyalty that had defined every choice he'd made since the moment he pulled a drowning stranger out of the sea. He caught the strike with both arms raised, bracing against jaws powerful enough to have taken Nazuna's entire wing off in a single bite. And this time, for the first time since his arrival in this world, Elaine watched him genuinely strain, feet driving deep furrows into wet sand, muscles standing out with real, visible effort, a sound tearing out of him that was not the flat, bored grunt of routine effort, but something raw and costly. The jaws held, locked against his forearms, neither advancing nor retreating, and for one suspended, terrible moment, Elaine understood, with a cold clarity that ran straight through every assumption she'd built over the past month, that they were watching something none of them had believed possible. Saitama, genuinely, visibly, tested. "Bernie," she said, voice tight, "tell me we have something, anything. Because whatever that thing's learning system just found, I don't think it's letting go of it." "Working on it," Bernie said, fingers flying across his console. "But Elaine, I don't have a weapon in this arsenal that scales anywhere close to what's happening on that beach right now. This isn't our fight to win with hardware. It's his. On the sand, straining against jaws built from stolen apocalypse and calibrated specifically to break him. Saitama's flat, unbothered calm had given way, for the first time since the tear opened over a Z-City crosswalk, to something the whole world watching the live feed would later describe, in 1,000 different languages, as the moment they finally understood what it actually cost him to be as strong as he was. Not because the strength itself demanded anything of him, but because the people he'd chosen to protect, always, eventually did. The strain lasted 4 seconds, an eternity, by the standard of every fight Elaine had watched him end in less time than it took to blink. And then something in Saitama's expression shifted, the raw effort folding back, not into ease exactly, but into a kind of grim, focused clarity that Elaine recognized, watching it happen, as a man choosing to stop holding back. "Genos," he said, voice tight but steady, still braced against the locked jaws. "Get Nazuna clear." Now, Genos didn't hesitate, thrusters flaring as he closed the distance and half-guided, half-shoved Nazuna's massive bulk backward across the sand, with a strength that belonged to a body built for exactly this kind of desperate intervention, her wings beating frantic and wide as she scrambled clear of the construct's reach, distress call cutting sharp across the beach. The instant she was clear, something in Saitama's stance changed, the bracing tension of a man holding a line giving way to the coiled, deliberate stillness Elaine had learned, over weeks, to recognize as the half-second before everything ended. "Okay," he said, quiet, almost to himself. "That's enough of that." He didn't punch upward this time, didn't aim for the joint where head met chassis. He drove both fists forward instead, directly into the locked jaws still clamped around his forearms, and the sound that followed didn't register on any of the outpost's audio equipment as a single event. Bernie would later describe the waveform as clipped, the sensors simply unable to capture the full spectrum of what happened in the fraction of a second the strike actually took. The construct's central head didn't just release him. It came apart, plating shearing away in a spray of gunmetal fragments and pulsing gold ichor, the reinforced chassis beneath it crumpling inward like something crushed by a hand far larger than the one that had actually struck it, and the shockwave of the impact alone drove a visible furrow through the wet sand 50 meters in every direction, kicking up a wall of displaced water and debris that briefly obscured the entire scene from the command truck's cameras. When the spray cleared, the construct's central head hung ruined and lifeless from a neck that had buckled at an unnatural angle, and its two remaining heads had gone very still, some crude remnant of self-preservation instinct. Organic, Elaine guessed. The last living fragment of whatever creature had contributed the biomass Apex had grafted into this thing, finally, belatedly, registering exactly what kind of mistake had just been made. "It's disengaging," Genos said, sensors tracking the construct's sudden, stumbling retreat toward open water. "Sensei, it's fleeing." Saitama stood in the crater his own strike had carved into the beach, chest heaving with the first genuine physical exertion Elaine had ever witnessed from him, and watched the wounded construct drag itself back into the surf with an expression that held no triumph at all, only a tired, complicated grief that she wouldn't fully understand until much later, when the post-battle analysis confirmed what Genos had already suspected, that whatever had powered that construct's learning system, whatever fragment of consciousness had still lived somewhere beneath all that stolen apocalypse and forced integration, had understood, in its final functioning moments, exactly what it was being made to do to people who had never wronged it. "Let it go," Saitama said, when Genos moved as if to pursue. "It's done. It's not gonna come back from that." He looked down at his own hands, still faintly trembling with residual effort, an expression crossing his face that Elaine had genuinely never seen there before. Something that looked, unmistakably, like the thing he'd told her, weeks ago, on this same beach, that he'd stopped believing he'd ever get to feel again. He looked, for the first time since the tear opened over a Z-City crosswalk, genuinely shaken. "Sensei." Genos was at his side instantly, scanning, worry cutting through his usual careful formality. "Are you injured?" "No," Saitama said slowly, flexing one hand, staring at it like it belonged to someone else. "No, I'm fine. Just..." He stopped, searching for words that plainly didn't come easily to a man who'd spent years believing this particular experience simply wasn't available to him anymore. That actually hurt. Not a lot. It's not bad, but it hurt Genos. For a second there, holding those jaws, it actually hurt. Genos went very still, the full weight of what his teacher had just said settling over him with visible force. "For the first time," he said quietly, "in longer than either of us can properly measure." Saitama didn't answer right away. He looked out at the water, where the wounded construct's silhouette had finally vanished beneath the swell, carrying with it, Elaine understood, both a very real strategic threat that Apex would have to answer for, and something far stranger and more personal. The first genuine crack, however small, in the flat, unbeatable ceiling that had defined this man's entire existence, long before he ever fell through a rift into a world that didn't know, yet, what to make of him. "Yeah," he said finally, and something in his exhausted voice carried, underneath the fatigue, the unmistakable, cautious shape of something Elaine had never once heard from him before. Hope. Word spread of the beach fight faster than any monarch statement could shape it. Raw footage this time, unfiltered, captured on a fisherman's phone from a hillside a kilometer off, and uploaded before anyone official even reached the scene. By mid-morning, the clip of Saitama shattering a Ghidorah-derived war machine to save a creature he'd pulled from the ocean weeks earlier had eclipsed every other story on every platform Josh checked, and the tenor of the public conversation had shifted in a way Elaine hadn't fully anticipated. Less fear now, more something that looked, uncomfortably, like reverence. "It's not just views anymore," Josh said, scrolling through an endless scroll of translated headlines from his perch at the annex kitchen table. "It's Elaine. There are vigils. In 3 countries. People are leaving flowers at coastal shrines with his name on hand-lettered signs. There's already a documentary crew requesting access." He looked up, something caught between awe and unease. "The world decided what he is a lot faster than I expected, and what it decided is protector, not threat. I genuinely didn't think that was the likely outcome 3 weeks ago." Elaine, exhausted from a night that had bled straight into an equally punishing morning of diplomatic calls, allowed herself a small, tired measure of relief at that. "Doesn't mean the threat conversation's gone," she said. "It means it's quieter now, buried under the parts of this that are easier to feel good about." She glanced toward the annex window, toward the beach where Saitama sat with Mizuna in the pale morning light, still visibly working through whatever the fight had shaken loose in him. "Apex's problem got a lot worse, though. You don't get to spin. We built a Ghidorah-derived weapon, and it nearly killed a rescued Titan hatchling and a public hero into anything defensible. Marchetti's already fielding requests from 4 separate international bodies wanting Apex's charter reviewed," Bernie confirmed, arriving with his tablet already lit, the particular grim satisfaction of a man who'd spent weeks distrusting a company, finally seeing the wider world catch up to his suspicion. "Formal sanctions look likely. Maybe criminal referrals for whoever signed off on the biomass sourcing, if investigators can prove where that Ghidorah tissue actually came from." He set the tablet down. "It's not over. Companies like that don't fold from one bad news cycle, however brutal. But it's the worst position Apex has been in since the Skull Island debacle, and that's not nothing." Walter Simmons received the news of the Construct's defeat with the same composed stillness that had carried him through every setback of his career. Though this time, watching him in the tower's top-floor office, Maya recognized something in her father's silence that she hadn't seen before. Not calculation, but genuine, uncomfortable recalibration. "The Ghidorah tissue," he said finally, staring out the window at a city skyline that had, over the course of one bad news cycle, become considerably less friendly territory for the company bearing his name. "Where did procurement actually source it?" "A black market broker with ties to the old Alan Jonah network," Maya said carefully. "Vetted through 3 cutouts. I signed off on the sourcing without asking harder questions than I should have." She let that admission sit, unflinching, the discipline of a woman who'd built her career on never hiding from her own mistakes even when hiding would have been easier. "I underestimated him. Both times. I thought the hybrids would demonstrate enough force to make cooperation feel inevitable. I thought the Construct would finally give us leverage strong enough that refusal stopped being a realistic option." She turned to face her father directly. "I was wrong on both counts, and I don't think we get a 3rd attempt without losing what remains of this company's standing entirely." Walter was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, something in his voice had shifted. Not defeat precisely, but the particular recalculation of a man reassessing an investment he'd finally, belatedly, recognized as unrecoverable through the methods he'd tried. "There is a version of this company," he said slowly, "that survives what's coming. It requires abandoning the acquisition strategy entirely. No more coercion, no more manufactured leverage, no attempt to own what that man represents." He turned from the window. "It requires instead an entirely different pitch, one built on genuine cooperation rather than extraction." I don't know if he'd ever trust anything Apex offered again, after this. I don't know if he should. A pause, unusually candid. But the alternative is watching this company dissolve under sanctions and criminal referrals within the year. And I have never once, in 30 years, Let pride cost me a company I could still save through a change of approach. Maya studied her father for a long moment, weighing the shift against everything she knew of him, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she believed him. "You want to make an actual apology," she said. "Not a legal one. A real one." "I want to survive," Walter said simply. "Sometimes those happen to be the same thing." He returned to his desk, already reaching for the phone that would begin the slow, humiliating process of formally, publicly disavowing a project his own daughter had championed weeks earlier. Draft the statement. Full disclosure on the hybrid program, full disclosure on the construct, and a formal offer of reparations to Otsuchihama and any other communities affected. No spin, no cutouts this time. He glanced up. "And Maya, reach out to Dr. Andrews directly, not through channels. I want Monarch to know this correction is genuine before the lawyers make it sound otherwise." The offer reached Elaine 3 days later, delivered not through Maya's usual polished diplomacy, but in a plain, unadorned message that read, in its entirety, as an admission Elaine hadn't expected Apex capable of making: "We were wrong. We'd like the chance, eventually, to prove it differently." No conditions attached to this message. Just an apology, and an open door if either of you ever want to walk through it. She brought it to Saitama on the beach, where he'd taken, over the past 3 days, to sitting quietly beside Nazuna each morning, in a ritual that had less to do with recovery now, and more, Elaine suspected, with simply sitting still long enough to let the strange new weight of feeling things settle into him properly. "Apex sent this," she said, handing him her tablet. "No strings, just an apology. I don't know what to make of it, honestly. Companies like that don't usually admit fault this cleanly." Saitama read it slowly, expression unreadable, and when he finally looked up, something in his tired, thoughtful eyes had settled into a decision that surprised her. "Doesn't mean I trust her," he said. "Or him. Probably won't. For a long time. Maybe ever." He handed the tablet back. "But I've spent my whole life dealing with people who never once said sorry for anything, even when they were dead wrong. Doesn't cost me anything to let this one actually mean it, if it turns out she does." He looked out at the water, at Nazuna's great head lifted toward the morning light. "Doesn't mean I'm working with them. Just means I'm not going to spend the rest of my time here hating somebody who's actually trying to fix what they broke. That's a different thing than trusting them." Genos, arriving with the quiet, watchful presence that had never fully left him, even in the calmer stretch of recent days, considered that, with the particular seriousness he brought to every judgment, involving his teacher's safety. "A cautious grace," he said slowly. "I've watched you extend that to very few people, Sensei, in all our years together. I think it's the right call here. I don't think it's an easy one." "Nothing about this whole thing's been easy," Saitama said, and something almost like a real, tired smile crossed his face. "Guess I'm getting used to that." The weeks that followed settled, finally and genuinely, into something that resembled peace. Not the fragile, watchful quiet of the outpost's early days, but a hard-won stability built on the visible, public proof of exactly what kind of protector this world had, against every doctrine and every fear chosen to trust. Godzilla surfaced twice more during that stretch, each time at a wary, respectful distance, and each time, Elaine noted with quiet fascination, withdrawing before real confrontation became necessary, some deep, ancient instinct apparently having settled, in its own vast and patient way, into an understanding that this particular fight was one better left unstarted. Nazuna's strength returned fully, her wings catching gold in full sunlight for the first time since the beach where they'd found her half-drowned, and she'd taken, in recent days, to short exploratory flights along the coast, always circling back, always returning to the same restricted beach that had become, unmistakably, home. And Saitama, Elaine watched him, on quiet evenings, sitting on that beach with an ease she hadn't seen in him during those first strange, bored days weeks ago, and understood, with a certainty that had grown slowly but completely over the course of this entire impossible story, that whatever had brought him tumbling through a rift over a grocery store crosswalk, whatever he'd lost or found in the strange, dangerous, ultimately transformative weeks that followed, he had, somewhere along the way, stopped simply existing in this world and started, genuinely, to live in it. "You ever gonna tell me if you're staying for good?" she asked him, one such evening, settling onto the sand beside him, while Genos and Nazuna occupied themselves further down the shore. "Or if that door's still open, someday, if a way home ever turns up." Saitama considered the question with the same unhurried honesty he brought to everything now, the flat boredom of that first morning, long since replaced by something quieter and more deliberately chosen. "Maybe someday there's a way back, and maybe I take it, because I miss my apartment, and my dumb little life, and the guy who runs the discount grocery I used to shop at." He looked out at the water, at the last light fading gold across a bay that had, in the space of 2 strange months, become the site of nearly everything that mattered to him now. "But I also found something here I didn't think I'd ever get to feel again. Something actually testing me. Something actually costing me for once, instead of just being over before it started." He glanced at her, and something warm and real crossed his tired, familiar face. "That's not nothing. Whatever happens next, wherever I end up, that's not nothing." Elaine, watching the sun finish setting over a world that had, against every doctrine and every fear, learned to make room for something it never had a category for, found she had no better answer than to simply sit there beside him, quiet and grateful, and let the moment be exactly what it was. The fight that ended Apex's ambitions off the Aleutian coast, the vigils lit in 3 countries, the careful new diplomacy monarch built in the wake of a secrecy doctrine that could never fully be restored, all of it settled, in time, into something the history books would eventually call a turning point, though nobody living through it in those first strange weeks had known to call it anything but survival. Saitama never did stop being disappointed by easy fights. That part of him, Elaine came to understand, wasn't something this world could fix, because it had never been a flaw to begin with. Only the shape strength took in a man who'd spent years training past every limit anyone else could imagine, and had simply been waiting, all that time, for a world with enough left in it to finally push back. He found that, in the end, not in Godzilla's ancient, wary power, and not in Apex's manufactured apocalypse, but in the quieter, harder work of choosing, every single day, to protect a world that hadn't asked for him and couldn't have earned him, a fishing village that no longer had to run at every siren, a Titan hatchling who finally, truly, had somewhere safe to land, a cyborg who'd stopped waiting for the day his teacher would finally, permanently lose, and started simply being grateful for the ordinary, hard-won piece of days that no longer needed him to. Whether the rift would ever open again, whether some path home still waited somewhere in the tangled space between worlds Bernie's instruments still couldn't fully map, none of them could say. But on quiet evenings, on a restricted beach where a bored man had once complained about spilled cabbage and stayed, in the end, to become something this world would remember for generations, that question had, slowly and without anyone quite deciding it, stopped being the only one that mattered.